Dr. Richard Wilson's scalpel froze mid-incision, his 30 years of surgical experience suddenly worthless as his eyes widened behind his glasses. What should have been routine lipoma removal from an elderly veteran's back had just become something medical journals would discuss for decades. "My God," whispered Nurse Peterson, the stainless steel basin clattering from her trembling hands to the floor. The sound echoed through the suddenly silent operating room as 5 medical professionals stared in disbelief. The mass that had grown on William Anderson's back for nearly 3 decades wasn't just abnormal tissue. Something metallic gleamed within it, perfectly preserved as though sealed in amber. Military dog tags, inside human tissue. "Get Dr. Miller in here, now!" Dr. Wilson's voice cracked, betraying the professional calm he'd maintained through countless surgeries. His gloved finger gently touched the impossible object. What secrets had this 78-year-old man carried within his own flesh? And what would happen when those secrets were finally exposed to the light? Leave a like and share your thoughts in the comments along with the city you're watching. From now, let's continue with the story. William Bill Anderson sat alone on his porch, watching the Georgia sunset paint the sky in streaks of amber and crimson. At 78, his once imposing frame had grown stooped, but his hands, large and calloused from decades in construction, still looked capable of building just about anything, except perhaps a reason to keep going. The rocking chair creaked beneath him, a sound that had once been accompanied by Eleanor's gentle humming from the chair beside his. 5 years since cancer took her, and still, sometimes, he caught himself turning to share a thought with the empty space she'd left. The azaleas she'd planted along the walkway bloomed in riotous pink, tended now by their daughter Jessica when she visited, though never with Eleanor's touch. Bill shifted uncomfortably, adjusting his position to accommodate the mass that had grown between his shoulder blades. It had started small back in '95, a lump no bigger than a marble that the mirror revealed during his morning shave. Eleanor had noticed immediately. "Get that checked, Billy," she'd insisted, worry creasing her brow. But William Anderson wasn't raised to run to doctors for every little thing. His father had worked through pneumonia. His grandfather had set his own broken arm. Anderson men endured, so he'd ignored it, through Eleanor's increasingly concerned prodding, through her illness, through her death. The lump had grown steadily over decades, from marble to golf ball to something closer to an orange, forcing adjustments to his wardrobe, higher collars, loose shirts, scarves even in summer. The pain had started 2 years ago, a dull ache at first, now sharp electrical jolts down his left arm that kept him from lying flat at night. His VA benefits would cover most of the surgery, but pride had kept him from making the call. Pride, and something deeper he couldn't articulate even to himself, as if the mass had become a physical manifestation of all he'd carried since Vietnam, a burden earned, perhaps even deserved. The porch steps creaked, announcing Jessica's arrival before she came into view. At 45, she had Eleanor's kind eyes and his stubborn chin, her nurse's scrubs still wrinkled from her hospital shift. "You're not even trying to hide the pain anymore, Dad," she said without preamble, setting a grocery bag on the small table beside him. No hello, no small talk. Directness was another trait she'd inherited from him. Bill grunted noncommittally, his gaze still fixed on the darkening horizon. "It's manageable." "Manageable isn't good enough," Jessica replied, pulling up the second rocker. "Olivia's coming tomorrow. She's found a specialist at Emory, top surgeon for these kinds of masses." Bill's jaw tightened. His granddaughter's pre-med ambitions had made her almost as bad as Eleanor had been about his health. "I don't need—" "You can barely turn your head, Dad," Jessica interrupted, her professional assessment cutting through his protest. "The twins' graduation is in 3 weeks. You want to be laid up in bed while Ethan gets his appointment to West Point?" The mention of his grandson's military future struck a nerve. Bill's weathered hand unconsciously moved to his chest, where his own service medals lay in a box he hadn't opened in decades. The same box that held memories of faces he'd spent a lifetime trying to forget. Especially one, Thomas "Tommy" Grayson, whose laughter had been as reliable as his aim, until that day near Khe Sanh when both were silenced forever. Or so Bill had believed. The waiting room at Emory University Hospital smelled of antiseptic and artificial lavender, a combination Bill Anderson found oddly nauseating. He shifted uncomfortably in the molded plastic chair, conscious of the weight between his shoulder blades. The mass seemed to throb in rhythm with his heartbeat, as if sensing its days were numbered. "Stop fidgeting, Grandpa," Olivia said, without looking up from her medical textbook. At 21, she had Eleanor's auburn hair, but Bill's steel-blue eyes, currently focused on diagrams of the human spine with unsettling intensity. "Dr. Wilson is the best thoracic surgeon in Georgia. You're in good hands." Bill grunted noncommittally. He wasn't worried about the doctor's competence. What troubled him was the exposure, not just of his flesh but of his weakness. For nearly 3 decades, he'd hidden the growing mass beneath carefully arranged collars and scarves, making it as invisible to others as the memories of Vietnam he'd buried deep within his mind. "Anderson?" The nurse's voice cut through his thoughts. "Dr. Wilson will see you now." Jessica rose first, her nurse's instincts taking over as she gathered Bill's paperwork. "Come on, Dad. Let's get this over with." The examination room was mercifully warmer than the waiting area. Dr. Richard Wilson, a trim man in his 50s with salt and pepper hair and wire-rimmed glasses, entered shortly after they were settled. His handshake was firm, his manner direct, but not unkind. "Mr. Anderson," he said, glancing through the file in his hands, "I understand you've been carrying this growth for quite some time." "Since '95, Bill admitted reluctantly. "Maybe earlier. Didn't really notice it at first." Dr. Wilson nodded, setting the file aside. "I'd like to examine it, if you don't mind removing your shirt." The simple request sent an unexpected wave of panic through Bill. Removing his carefully constructed armor in front of his daughter and granddaughter seemed suddenly impossible. He'd spent decades ensuring they never saw the full extent of his burden. Jessica sensed his hesitation. "Olivia and I can step out if you'd prefer, Dad." "No," Bill said, surprising himself. "You've been after me about this for years. Might as well see what all the fuss is about." With fingers that trembled slightly, he unbuttoned his flannel shirt and shrugged it off his shoulders. The sharp intake of breath from Olivia told him what he already knew. The mass was worse than they'd imagined. Dr. Wilson's professional demeanor didn't falter as he approached. "May I?" he asked, hands hovering near Bill's back. At Bill's nod, the doctor's fingers gently probed the growth. "How long has it been painful?" "Couple years," Bill answered, wincing as the doctor touched a particularly sensitive spot. "Gets worse in damp weather." "It's pressing on nerve roots," Dr. Wilson explained, continuing his examination. "That's causing the pain down your arm. The good news is the mass appears to be a lipoma, a fatty tumor generally benign. The concerning factor is its location and size." He stepped back, allowing Bill to replace his shirt. "I'd like to schedule an MRI to confirm, but I believe surgical removal is warranted sooner rather than later." "How soon?" Jessica asked, her professional mode engaged. "I have an opening for the MRI tomorrow morning. If that confirms my assessment, we could schedule surgery for Friday." Bill buttoned his shirt with deliberate slowness, buying time. 3 days. After decades of avoidance, just 3 days until the physical burden would be removed. The thought should have brought relief, but instead an inexplicable dread settled in his stomach. "Grandpa?" Olivia's voice was gentler than he'd heard it in years. "This is good news. You'll feel so much better once it's gone." Bill nodded mutely. He wasn't sure he deserved to feel better. Some burdens weren't meant to be set down. The MRI machine's rhythmic thumping reminded Bill of distant artillery fire. He lay face down on the narrow platform, trying to control his breathing as memories threatened to surface. Sweat beaded on his forehead despite the room's chill. "You're doing great, Mr. Anderson," the technician's disembodied voice assured him through a speaker. "Just a few more minutes." Bill closed his eyes, but that only made the memories more vivid. Suddenly, he was back in the monsoon-drenched jungle of Vietnam, the weight of Tommy Grayson heavy across his shoulders as he staggered through the mud, blood soaking both their uniforms. "Hang on, Tommy," he'd pleaded, the words as clear in his mind now as they had been 55 years ago. "Just hang on. We're almost there." But they hadn't been almost there. The firefight had separated them from their unit, leaving Bill to navigate miles of hostile territory with his wounded friend. By the time he'd found an American patrol, Tommy had gone still and cold. The medic had merely shaken his head, and Bill, exhausted and in shock from his own shrapnel wounds, had collapsed. "Mr. Anderson, we're finished. You can sit up slowly now." Bill blinked, disoriented as the platform slid out from the machine. The present reasserted itself, the sterile medical facility a world away from the humid jungle of his memories. Yet the weight remained, physical and metaphorical, a half-century burden he'd never put down. Doctor. Wilson's office was comfortably appointed, the degrees on the wall lending authority to his concerned expression as he showed them the MRI images on his computer screen. "The good news is it's definitely a lipoma," he explained, pointing to the large, defined mass. "No signs of malignancy. However, as you can see, it's developed in a problematic location, with multiple nerve roots in close proximity. That's what's causing your pain, Mr. Anderson." "So surgery is the only option?" Jessica asked, leaning forward to study the images. "I'm afraid so. Left untreated, the compression on these nerves will worsen. You could eventually face mobility issues, possibly even paralysis." Bill stared at the ghostly image of his spine, the large white mass nestled against it like a parasite. "And the surgery? What's involved?" "It's relatively straightforward. A 3 to 4 inch incision, careful dissection of the mass from surrounding tissues, then closure. You'll need to stay overnight for observation, but most patients recover quickly. The nerve pain should resolve almost immediately." Bill nodded slowly, his decision made not by courage, but by the realization that he'd run out of alternatives. Friday, then. The night before surgery, Bill sat at Eleanor's writing desk in their bedroom, the lamp casting a warm circle of light in the otherwise darkened room. He'd avoided this desk since her passing, preserving it like a museum exhibit of their shared life. Tonight, however, he felt compelled to sit where she had sat, to touch the things she had touched. The drawers still contained her stationery, cream-colored with a simple E embossed at the top. His fingers trembled slightly as he extracted a sheet and reached for a pen. Some impulse, perhaps the same that had kept him from seeking medical attention for so many years, urged him to leave something behind in case the surgery went wrong. "Dear Jessica, Olivia, and Ethan," he began, then paused, the pen hovering over the paper. What did one write in such a letter? Not a goodbye. Dr. Wilson had assured him the procedure was routine. Not a confession. Some burdens were his alone to carry. Yet something compelled him to commit words to paper, as if the impending surgery had loosened something long locked away. "If you're reading this, it means things didn't go as planned. Or maybe I just couldn't bring myself to tell you these things face to face. Probably the latter. There are things a man carries that aren't visible, things heavier than any growth on the back. I've carried such things since before you were born, Jess, since before your mother was born." The pen moved more quickly now, decades of unspoken thoughts finding release. "Vietnam wasn't just a war I fought in. It was a place that changed me in ways I've never explained to anyone, not even your grandmother. There was a man named Thomas Grayson. We called him Tommy, best marksman in our unit, could hit a cigarette at 300 yards. Always had a joke even when we were knee-deep in mud with leeches climbing our legs. Bill's hand began to shake, forcing him to set down the pen momentarily. The memories, usually kept at bay by bourbon and busy work, flooded back with overwhelming clarity. It was near Quezon, raining like God himself was trying to wash away the whole country. We were pinned down, taking fire from positions we couldn't even see through the downpour. Tommy and I were separated from our unit, trying to make it back to friendly lines. Bill closed his eyes, the sound of rain in his memory so vivid he half expected to find himself soaked when he opened them again. There was an explosion. I don't remember much after that, just fragments. The weight of him as I carried him through the jungle. The blood that wouldn't stop no matter how hard I pressed on the wound. His voice growing weaker, telling me to leave him, to save myself. I didn't leave him, I couldn't, but I couldn't save him either. The pen stilled again as Bill's throat constricted with emotion he'd refused to acknowledge for over 50 years. They told me later he died before we reached the medical unit, that nothing could have been done. I received a Purple Heart for bringing his body back through enemy territory. They called me a hero. I am not a hero. Heroes save people. I just carried a dead man through a jungle. Bill became aware of moisture on his cheeks and brushed it away roughly with the back of his hand. Men of his generation didn't cry. Certainly not Anderson men. His father would have been ashamed. I never told your grandmother the full story. She knew I had nightmares, knew there were nights I'd wake up shouting Tommy's name, but I spared her the details. Maybe that was wrong. Maybe if I'd talked about it, things would have been different. The clock now read 3:42 a.m. Bill's hand cramped from the unaccustomed activity of writing, but he pressed on. When the lump first appeared years after your grandmother passed, I convinced myself it was a punishment, a physical manifestation of the guilt I've carried. Foolish, I know. Your mother would say so, and she'd be right. I don't know why I'm telling you this now. Perhaps it's the prospect of surgery. Perhaps it's just an old man's rambling. But I want you to know that whatever they find tomorrow, whatever happens, I've lived a life weighted by things unsaid. Don't make my mistake. Don't carry burdens alone until they become too heavy to bear. I'm proud of you all, Jessica, with your compassion and strength. Olivia, with your determination to heal others. Ethan, with your courage to serve, even knowing the cost such service can demand. You are the best parts of your grandmother and the person I might have been without the war. Love, Grandpa. Bill set down the pen and stared at the letter. The confession felt both liberating and terrifying. Would they think less of him? Would they see the cowardice beneath the stoic exterior he'd maintained all these years? Dad? Bill startled, turning to find Jessica standing in the doorway, her nurse's scrubs suggesting she'd just returned from a night shift. "What are you doing up?" she asked, concern evident in her voice. "You need to rest before tomorrow." "Couldn't sleep," Bill replied, attempting to discreetly cover the letter with his hand. Jessica crossed the room, the weariness in her movements reminding Bill that his daughter was no longer young herself. Middle age had crept up on her while he wasn't paying attention. "What's that?" she asked, nodding toward the partially concealed paper. Bill hesitated, then slowly removed his hand. "Just putting some thoughts down." Jessica's eyes scanned the visible portion of the letter, then lifted to meet her father's gaze. "Dad," she said softly, "why haven't you ever talked about this?" "Men of my generation didn't talk about such things," Bill said, the response automatic. "We came home, we moved on, we built lives." did you?" Jessica asked, pulling Eleanor's desk chair closer and sitting down. "Move on?" The question hung in the air between them, simple, yet devastating in its accuracy. "I thought I had," Bill finally said, "until your mother got sick. Then everything unraveled." Jessica reached for his hand, her touch gentle yet firm, the touch of someone accustomed to providing comfort. "Mom would have wanted you to talk about it, to get help." "Your mother wanted a lot of things I couldn't give her," Bill admitted, the confession bitter on his tongue. "She wanted you to be happy, Dad. That's all she ever wanted." Bill looked at his daughter, really looked at her, and saw Eleanor in the determined set of her jaw, in the compassionate eyes that missed nothing. "I've disappointed you," he said, the realization bringing fresh pain. Jessica shook her head. "No, you've worried me. There's a difference. All these years, the lump, I should have—" "Yes, you should have," Bill interrupted, his tone matter-of-fact rather than accusatory. "But we're here now. Tomorrow they'll remove it, and you can start fresh." Bill glanced down at the letter. "I'm not sure I know how to do that anymore." "Nobody does," Jessica said with a small smile. "We just fumble through and hope for the best. That's what Mom always said. Remember?" Bill did remember. Eleanor's practical philosophy had been a ballast during their 30 years together. "Your mother was a wise woman. She married you, didn't she?" Jessica's attempt at lightening the mood worked, drawing a reluctant smile from Bill. They sat in companionable silence for a moment, the ticking of the grandfather clock in the hallway marking the passage of time. "You should try to sleep," Jessica finally said. "I'll stay here tonight. Olivia's bringing Ethan over in the morning to go to the hospital with us." Bill nodded, suddenly exhausted. The emotional toll of writing the letter, of speaking truths long buried, had drained what little energy he'd had. As Jessica helped him back to his recliner, the bed he'd abandoned when lying flat became too painful, Bill felt an unfamiliar sensation. Not the physical discomfort he'd grown accustomed to, but something lighter. Perhaps, he thought as sleep finally began to claim him, this was what the first step toward unburdening felt like. Morning arrived with pale sunlight filtering through the blinds and the smell of coffee brewing. Bill opened his eyes to find Ethan sitting across from him, the letter open in his hands. At 18, his grandson already had the composed demeanor of a soldier, the result of years in ROTC and a lifetime preparing to follow in footsteps Bill had rarely discussed. "Morning, Grandpa," Ethan said, his expression unreadable. Bill felt exposed, vulnerable in a way physical nakedness could never achieve. "You read it?" It wasn't a question, but Ethan nodded anyway. "Mom thought we should. Before the surgery." Bill couldn't bring himself to ask the real question. "Do you think less of me now?" Ethan carefully refolded the letter, his movements deliberate. "My commanding officer says the strongest soldiers are the ones who acknowledge their wounds, not just the ones on their skin." Before Bill could respond, Olivia appeared in the doorway, her expression softer than he'd seen in months. "Time to go, Grandpa. Today's the day you finally get rid of your unwanted companion." Bill nodded, allowing Ethan to help him stand. As they made their way to the car where Jessica waited, Bill felt a strange mixture of dread and anticipation. Whatever happened in the operating room, he had already begun a different kind of surgery, the excision of secrets too long carried alone. The hospital corridors seemed endless, the preoperative procedures a blur of forms, questions, and reassurances. It wasn't until he was being wheeled toward the operating room, his family forced to remain behind, that panic gripped him. "Wait!" he called, reaching for Olivia's hand as she walked alongside the gurney. "I can't." "You can," she said firmly, squeezing his fingers. "We'll be right here when you wake up." "The letter," Bill began, needing to say more, to explain. "We'll be waiting for more stories when you're ready to tell them." Olivia finished for him. "This isn't the end, Grandpa. It's just the removal of something that's been holding you back." As the doors to the operating room loomed ahead, Bill took a deep breath. Perhaps she was right. Perhaps today marked not just the excision of a physical burden, but the beginning of a different kind of healing, 50 years overdue. The operating room hummed with the quiet efficiency of modern medicine. Monitors beeped steadily, tracking Bill Anderson's vital signs as the anesthesiologist carefully maintained his sedation. Dr. Wilson worked with methodical precision, his experienced hands making the initial incision across the base of the prominent mass that had been Bill's unwanted companion for nearly 3 decades. "Tissue appears consistent with lipoma," he commented to the surgical team. "Capsule is well defined." Nurse Peterson adjusted the overhead light, providing better illumination as Dr. Wilson began the delicate process of separating the mass from surrounding tissues. The growth had established itself in an inconvenient location, nestled against the cervical spine with numerous nerve roots in dangerous proximity. "We'll need to go slowly here," Dr. Wilson cautioned. "There's significant vascularity." For 20 minutes, the surgery progressed exactly as expected. The careful dissection of a large but otherwise unremarkable fatty tumor. The team worked in focused silence, the only sounds the steady beep of monitors and occasional requests for instruments. "Almost there," Dr. Wilson murmured, more to himself than the team. "Just need to free this last attachment near the spine." His hand suddenly froze mid-motion. The scalpel hovered, trembling slightly. "Dr. Wilson?" Nurse Peterson prompted after several seconds of uncharacteristic stillness. "There's something." His voice trailed off as he carefully retracted the tissue. "Hand me the finer forceps, please." The atmosphere in the operating room shifted, tension rising as Dr. Wilson delicately probed deeper into the mass. His expression, visible only through his eyes above his surgical mask, changed from concentration to disbelief. "What is it?" the resident assisting him asked. Dr. Wilson didn't immediately answer, instead working with heightened focus to expose what had caught his attention. "There's a foreign object embedded in the capsule. Metallic." The surgical team exchanged glances. Finding foreign bodies wasn't unheard of, but within an otherwise typical lipoma, it was unusual to say the least. "Looks like it's been there for decades," Dr. Wilson continued, carefully freeing the object from the surrounding tissue. "The body has completely encapsulated it." As he extracted the item, the operating room fell silent. Even the steady beeping of monitors seemed to fade into the background as every eye focused on the small, tarnished piece of metal in Dr. Wilson's forceps. "Are those—" Nurse Peterson began. "Dog tags, Doctor." Wilson confirmed, his voice barely above a whisper. "Military dog tags." The resident leaned closer. "How is that possible? A lipoma doesn't form around foreign objects like this." "This isn't just a lipoma," Dr. Wilson said, examining the growth with new understanding. "This is something I've never seen before. The body has created a protective capsule around the tags, almost like a biological safe," completed Dr. Anna Miller, the pathologist who had just entered the operating room in response to an urgent page. She approached the table, her experienced eyes widening at the sight. "Extraordinary. The tissue has formed a perfect preservation chamber." Dr. Wilson carefully placed the tags in a specimen dish that Nurse Peterson held out. "Can you make out the name?" Dr. Miller leaned closer, adjusting her glasses. "Grayson Thomas J. Blood type O negative. Religious preference, Protestant." She looked up, meeting Dr. Wilson's gaze. "These aren't Mr. Anderson's tags?" "No," Dr. Wilson agreed, returning his attention to the surgical field. "And there might be more." His prediction proved accurate. As they continued the careful dissection, a second metallic object emerged, a fragment of what appeared to be shrapnel, approximately the size of a dime, darkened with age but preserved within the same biological capsule that had housed the tags. "I need to complete the removal," Dr. Wilson said, refocusing on the primary surgical objective. "But I want this entire specimen sent to pathology intact. This is unprecedented." The remainder of the surgery proceeded with heightened care, the team working to remove the mass without disrupting the remarkable biological adaptation they'd discovered. What had begun as a routine procedure had transformed into something none of them had encountered in their medical careers. 90 minutes later, Dr. Wilson placed the final suture, securing the surgical site with meticulous attention. The mass, now removed and preserved in a specimen container, would head directly to pathology for comprehensive analysis. "I've been a surgeon for 30 years, Dr. Wilson said as he stepped back from the table, "and I've never seen anything like this. The human body never ceases to amaze me." As the team prepared to transfer Bill to recovery, Dr. Wilson's thoughts turned to the conversation that would follow when his patient awoke. How does one explain to a man that he's been carrying not just a tumor but a piece of history, perhaps his own history, embedded in his body for what must have been half a century? The recovery room was quiet except for the soft beeping of monitors and occasional murmurs of nurses checking on patients. Bill Anderson lay still, his breathing steady as the anesthesia gradually released its hold. The white bandage at the base of his neck stood in stark contrast to his sun-weathered skin. "Doctor?" Wilson sat beside the bed, the specimen container holding the dog tags on the table next to him. He'd debated waiting until Bill was fully recovered before sharing the discovery, but something told him this patient had waited long enough for truth. Bill's eyelids fluttered, then opened. Confusion clouded his gaze momentarily before focusing on Dr. Wilson. "It's done?" His voice emerged as a hoarse whisper. "Yes, Mr. Anderson. The surgery went well. We were able to remove the entire growth." Bill's hand moved instinctively toward his neck, stopping short of the bandaged area. "Feels strange. Lighter." "I imagine it does, after carrying it for so many years." Dr. Wilson paused, choosing his next words carefully. "Mr. Anderson, we found something unexpected during the surgery, something inside the growth." A flicker of emotion. Was it fear? Resignation? Crossed Bill's face. "Cancer?" "No, nothing like that." Dr. Wilson reached for the specimen container. "We found these." Bill's eyes, still foggy from anesthesia, struggled to focus on the container. When recognition dawned, the color drained from his face. "That's not possible," he whispered. "I assure you it is. These dog tags were embedded deep within the tissue. They've been there for many years, judging by the condition of both the tags and the biological response around them." Bill's hand trembled as he reached for the container, his fingers pressing against the clear plastic as if trying to touch the tags themselves. "Thomas Grayson," he read, his voice breaking on the name. "You know him," Dr. Wilson said. It wasn't a question. Bill closed his eyes, his chest rising and falling with increasingly rapid breaths. The monitor beside his bed registered the spike in his heart rate. "Mr. Anderson, try to stay calm. You're still recovering from anesthesia." Dr. Wilson placed a steadying hand on Bill's arm. "We don't need to discuss this now if it's too difficult." "No." Bill's eyes opened, suddenly clear and focused with an intensity that belied his post-surgical state. "I've waited 55 years. I'm not waiting another minute." Dr. Wilson nodded, understanding the determination in the older man's voice. "Would you like me to call your family in?" Bill hesitated, then nodded. "Jessica, just Jessica for now." While a nurse went to fetch Bill's daughter, Dr. Wilson observed his patient's face, the play of emotions across features that had maintained stoic reserve throughout their previous interactions. Whatever story lay behind those dog tags, it was clearly one that had shaped Bill Anderson's life in profound ways. Jessica entered the recovery room moments later, her nurse's training evident in the way she quickly assessed her father's condition before allowing relief to soften her expression. "The surgery went well?" she asked, looking to Dr. Wilson for confirmation even as she took her father's hand. "Very well," Dr. Wilson assured her, "but we made an unexpected discovery that your father wants to discuss." Jessica's gaze shifted to the specimen container, her brow furrowing in confusion at the sight of the dog tags. "Dad?" she prompted gently. Bill drew a shaky breath. "It's Tommy's tags," he said, his voice suddenly sounding every one of his 78 years. "Thomas Grayson from Vietnam." Jessica looked between her father and the dog tags, comprehension slowly dawning. "The soldier you mentioned in your letter? The one you couldn't save?" Bill nodded, a single tear tracking down his weathered cheek. "I've been carrying him with me all this time, and I didn't even know it." Dr. Wilson watched this exchange with growing understanding. The letter Jessica mentioned must have contained part of this story, a story that clearly held profound significance for his patient. "Mr. Anderson," he said gently, "from a medical perspective, what we found is extraordinary. Your body created a specialized capsule around these foreign objects, preserving them while protecting your own tissues from damage. It's a biological adaptation I've never encountered before." Bill hardly seemed to register the doctor's words, his focus fixed on the dog tags. "I thought they were buried with him," he murmured. "They told me he was laid to rest with full military honors." Dr. Wilson exchanged a glance with Jessica, both recognizing the need to proceed carefully. "Mr. Anderson, these tags raise some questions about what actually happened. Would it help to speak with someone from Veterans Affairs? Perhaps they could provide information about Thomas Grayson's records." Bill's gaze snapped to Dr. Wilson's face, sudden hope lighting his eyes with an intensity that was almost painful to witness. "Records. You think there might be more information about what happened to him?" "It's possible," Dr. Wilson said cautiously. "Military record-keeping has improved significantly in recent decades, especially with digitization efforts." Jessica squeezed her father's hand. "Dad, let's focus on your recovery first. Once you're stronger—" "No," Bill interrupted with unexpected firmness. "I've waited too long already. If there's any chance of learning the truth about Tommy, I need to know." He turned to Dr. Wilson. "How soon can I get out of here, Doc?" Dr. Wilson couldn't help but smile at the transformation in his patient. The man who had reluctantly dragged himself to a consultation a week ago was now ready to discharge himself in pursuit of answers. "Typically, I'd want to keep you overnight for observation after removing a mass of that size," he explained, "but I understand the urgency you feel. Let's compromise. Stay until tomorrow morning. Give your body a chance to recover from the anesthesia, and then we'll discuss discharge." Bill seemed about to protest, but Jessica interjected, "That's more than fair, Dad. Besides, it will give me time to contact the VA and see what information we might be able to access." Reluctantly, Bill agreed. As the initial surge of adrenaline faded, the reality of his post-surgical condition began to assert itself in waves of discomfort and fatigue. "Rest now," Dr. Wilson advised, standing to leave. "We'll talk more when you're feeling stronger." As he turned to go, Bill called after him, "Doc, thank you. Not just for the surgery, but for—" He gestured toward the dog tags, seemingly unable to articulate the full significance of the discovery. Dr. Wilson nodded in understanding. "Sometimes the body keeps secrets, even from ourselves, Mr. Anderson. I'm glad we could bring this one to light." After the doctor left, Jessica pulled her chair closer to her father's bedside. "Do you want to talk about it? About Thomas?" Bill looked at his daughter, perhaps seeing for the first time how much he had kept from her over the years, how many pieces of himself he had hidden away, just as his body had hidden those dog tags. "Yes," he said finally. "I think it's time I told you the whole story." As Bill began to speak, memories he had suppressed for decades came flooding back with vivid clarity. The monsoon rains of Vietnam, the weight of combat gear in sweltering jungle heat, and Thomas Grayson's voice, always ready with a joke even in the darkest moments. For the first time in 55 years, Bill Anderson allowed himself to remember fully, not just the guilt and grief he had carried, but the friendship that had preceded the loss. And as he spoke, the burden he had carried seemed to lighten, just as his neck now felt strangely weightless without its longtime companion. The dog tags gleamed under the recovery room lights, a physical manifestation of the past that had shaped him, a past that perhaps wasn't fully laid to rest after all. 3 days after surgery, Bill sat at his kitchen table, the dog tags resting on a clean handkerchief before him. He'd spent hours staring at them, running his fingers over the embossed letters. Grayson, Thomas J. The metal was worn smooth in places, tarnished in others, bearing silent witness to decades encased within his body. The house was quiet. Jessica had reluctantly returned to work after Bill insisted he could manage on his own. "I've been taking care of myself since before you were born," he'd reminded her, though they both knew self-care had never been his strong suit. His neck felt strange, lighter certainly, but also vulnerable. The surgical site was healing well, according to Dr. Wilson at yesterday's follow-up appointment, but Bill kept expecting to feel the familiar weight and pressure that had been his constant companion for nearly 30 years. The doorbell rang, startling him from his reverie. Bill carefully folded the handkerchief around the dog tags before making his way to the front door. Olivia stood on the porch, a manila folder tucked under her arm. "Thought you'd be at your lab," Bill said by way of greeting, stepping aside to let her in. "Took the morning off," Olivia replied, her eyes quickly assessing her grandfather with the clinical gaze she'd developed during her pre-med studies. "You look better. More color in your face." Bill grunted non-committally and led the way back to the kitchen. "Coffee's still hot." Olivia helped herself to a mug from the cabinet, Eleanor's favorite, Bill noted with a pang, and settled across from him at the table. She placed the folder between them but didn't open it immediately. "Mom told me about the dog tags," she said, her direct approach reminiscent of Eleanor. "About Thomas Grayson." Bill nodded, unwrapping the handkerchief to reveal the tags. "Still can't believe they were inside me all this time." "I've been doing some research," Olivia continued, tapping the folder. "Called in some favors at the VA where I volunteer." Bill's pulse quickened. "And?" Olivia opened the folder with deliberate care, revealing photocopied documents bearing military insignia. Thomas J. Shawn Grayson, Private First Class, U.S. East Army, served in Vietnam from 1967 to 1969. Bill nodded. "We were in the same unit, 173rd Airborne Brigade." "He was reported missing in action in March 1968, Olivia continued, "following an ambush near Khe Sanh." "Not missing," Bill corrected, his voice rough with emotion. "He died in my arms. I carried his body back to our lines." Olivia's eyes softened with compassion. "That's what you believed happened, Grandpa. But according to these records, he was listed as MIA, not KIA. Bill stared at her, uncomprehending. "That's impossible. I was there. I felt him go still." "They took his body from me at the field hospital. Did you actually see him pronounced dead by a doctor?" Olivia asked gently. Bill opened his mouth to respond, then closed it again. The memories of that day had always been fragmented, distorted by pain, exhaustion, and what he now recognized as the early symptoms of what would later be called PTSD. "I was injured too," he said slowly. "Took shrapnel in my back and leg. They gave me morphine when we reached the medical unit. Everything after that is blurry." Olivia nodded, turning to another document in the folder. "There's more, Grandpa. According to this report dated June 1968, a wounded American soldier was found by North Vietnamese forces and held as a prisoner of war. He was later identified as Thomas Jacobs Grayson." The kitchen seemed to tilt around Bill. He gripped the edge of the table to steady himself, the implications of Olivia's words crashing over him in waves. "He was alive?" Bill's voice emerged as barely more than a whisper. "He was taken to a POW camp near the Chinese border," Olivia confirmed, her expression gentle but firm, giving her grandfather time to process each piece of information. "He was held there until the Paris Peace Accords in 1973, when he was repatriated along with other American POWs. Bill shook his head in disbelief. "That's not possible. They would have notified me. His family would have—" The records indicate his identification was complicated by severe injuries and initial confusion about his identity. By the time he was properly identified, years had passed. Bill's thoughts raced, memories recalibrating against this new reality. "Are you telling me that Tommy survived? That he came home?" Olivia hesitated, clearly weighing how much to share at once. "According to these records, yes. He was repatriated in 1973 and received medical treatment at Walter Reed for nearly 2 years. 2 years, Bill echoed, imagining the severity of injuries that would require such prolonged care. "He lost both legs below the knee," Olivia said quietly, "and suffered other significant injuries. But he survived, Grandpa. He came home." Bill stared at the dog tags, gleaming dully on the handkerchief. For 55 years he'd carried the weight of Tommy's death, a burden that had shaped his entire life. The guilt, the nightmares, the emotional walls he'd built between himself and everyone except Eleanor, all based on a truth that wasn't true at all. "Where is he now?" Bill asked, afraid to hope yet unable to stop himself. Olivia turned to the final page in the folder. "His last known address was in Maplewood, Tennessee. As of 5 years ago, he was still living there." "Tennessee," Bill repeated. "That's less than a day's drive from here." "Grandpa," Olivia began cautiously, "we don't know what kind of life he's had, what kind of man he is now. War changes people, and he endured things we can't imagine." "I have to find him," Bill said, the decision crystallizing with sudden clarity. "I have to know if he's still alive." Olivia nodded, having anticipated this reaction. "I thought you might say that. I've already called the VA office in Tennessee. They can't give us personal information, but they've agreed to pass along a message if he's still in their system." Bill reached across the table and covered his granddaughter's hand with his own, a rare gesture of physical affection. "Thank you, Olivia, for all of this." She smiled, turning her hand to squeeze his. "There's one more thing." She reached into her bag and pulled out a small rectangular device. "I recorded our conversation with the VA officer. There's something you should hear." She pressed a button, and a woman's professional voice filled the kitchen. "While I can't confirm current contact information for privacy reasons, I can tell you that Mr. Grayson has been a regular at our veteran support services until quite recently. He's well known in our community." Olivia stopped the recording. "She's telling us he's alive, Grandpa, as of a few months ago at least." Bill stood abruptly, his chair scraping against the linoleum. "I need to go there, now." "Whoa," Olivia cautioned, standing to place a steadying hand on his arm. "You just had major surgery 3 days ago. Dr. Wilson said no driving for at least a week and no trips for 2. "I've waited 55 years, Bill insisted. "I'm not waiting another 2 weeks. Then let me drive you, Olivia countered. Mom has shifts all weekend and Ethan is home on leave. We could leave Friday after my last class. Bill wanted to argue, to insist on leaving immediately, but the surgical site throbbed as if in warning. At 78, recovery didn't come as quickly as it once had. Friday, he conceded reluctantly. Olivia nodded, relief evident in her expression. I'll make the arrangements. But Grandpa, she added, her tone sobering, you need to prepare yourself for all possibilities. He might not want to see you. He might not be the Tommy you remember. Bill nodded, knowing she was right but unwilling to consider any scenario that might delay the meeting. I just need to return these to him, he said, indicating the dog tags. The rest is up to him. After Olivia left, promising to return Friday morning for their journey, Bill remained at the kitchen table lost in thought. The house around him seemed different somehow, the familiar rooms charged with new energy, as if the walls themselves were shedding decades of accumulated grief alongside him. He made his way to the small den that had been his retreat since Eleanor's passing, where a locked drawer in his desk contained memorabilia he'd rarely allowed himself to examine. The key was kept on his key ring, though he couldn't remember the last time he'd used it. The drawer opened with a protesting creak. Inside lay his own military decorations, including the Purple Heart awarded for the very action that had haunted him for decades. Beneath them, wrapped in tissue paper that had yellowed with age, was a photograph, the only one he'd kept from Vietnam. Bill unwrapped it carefully, revealing a group of young men in jungle fatigues, arms slung around each other's shoulders, exhaustion and camaraderie etched on their dirt-streaked faces. He found himself easily in the image, leaner, standing taller, a cigarette dangling from lips that smiled more readily then, and beside him, grinning widely despite the circumstances, was Thomas Grayson. Bill traced his finger over Tommy's face, memories flooding back with painful clarity. The jokes Tommy would tell during long patrols to keep morale up, the harmonica he played so beautifully in the evenings, the letters from his girl back home that he would read aloud, sharing the small piece of normalcy with his battle brothers. You were alive, Bill whispered to the photograph. All this time, you were alive. The realization brought both joy and a crushing new guilt. While Bill had been building his construction business, raising Jessica, loving Eleanor, and later retreating into isolated grief, Tommy had been fighting his own battles, first for survival in a POW camp, then for recovery in a military hospital, and finally for some semblance of normal life as a disabled veteran. Had Tommy looked for him? Had he wondered why his friend never reached out? The questions multiplied, each more painful than the last. Bill's reflection was interrupted by the telephone. Jessica's voice came through the line, concerned about his first day alone after surgery. I'm fine, he assured her, deciding against sharing Olivia's discoveries for now. This journey felt private somehow, something he needed to process before widening the circle of knowledge. Just taking it easy like the doctor ordered. After placating Jessica with promises to eat a proper dinner and take his medications on schedule, Bill returned to the photograph, studying it as if it might yield additional secrets. A detail he'd never noticed before caught his attention, a small medal pinned to Tommy's uniform. Bill retrieved a magnifying glass from Eleanor's sewing basket, still kept intact in the living room cabinet, and examined the image more closely. The medal was a combat infantryman badge, standard issue for those who had seen battle. But pinned beside it was something personal, a small silver cross. Bill remembered now. Tommy had been religious, attending the makeshift services held by the chaplain whenever possible. The cross had been a gift from his mother, he'd said, to keep him safe. It hadn't kept him safe, Bill thought bitterly. Nothing could in that hellish place. But perhaps it had given him strength during those years of captivity and recovery, strength Bill couldn't imagine. The next 3 days passed with excruciating slowness. Bill alternated between periods of frenetic preparation, researching Maplewood, Tennessee, planning their route, rehearsing what he might say to Tommy, and moments of paralyzing doubt. What right did he have to disrupt this man's life after so many decades? What if the reunion brought back trauma better left buried? But always his thoughts returned to the dog tags. They had been preserved within his body for a reason. The coincidence was too profound to ignore. Whether by divine intervention or some mysterious biological process, Bill had been carrying a piece of his friend all these years. Returning the tags felt like a sacred duty, perhaps the most important mission of his life. By Friday morning, Bill was packed and waiting on the porch when Olivia's car pulled into the driveway. Ethan accompanied her, his military bearing evident even in civilian clothes. Moral support, Olivia explained as Ethan took Bill's small suitcase. Plus, he's better with maps than I am. The drive to Tennessee would take approximately 7 hours, Olivia had calculated. They planned to arrive by late afternoon, stay overnight at a motel, and make contact the following morning. Bill had insisted on this timeline, wanting to give Tommy proper notice rather than appearing unannounced. As they settled into the car, Ethan in the back seat with a spread of maps and printouts, Bill felt a strange sense of lightness. The surgical site still ached, a constant reminder of the physical burden he'd carried for decades. But the emotional weight, the guilt, the grief, the unanswered questions had shifted. Not disappeared, but transformed into something more manageable, more purposeful. "Ready, Grandpa?" Olivia asked, starting the engine. Bill nodded, his hand unconsciously touching the breast pocket of his shirt where Tommy's dog tags now rested, wrapped in the same handkerchief that had held them since their discovery. "I've been ready for 55 years, he replied. "I just didn't know it." As they drove through the Georgia countryside, heading north toward Tennessee, Bill gazed out the window at the passing landscape. The rolling hills and small towns seemed somehow more vibrant, more immediate than they had in years. It was as if a film had been removed from his vision, allowing him to see the world with renewed clarity. "Tell us about him," Ethan requested from the back seat. "About Thomas Grayson." Bill hesitated, the habit of silence deeply ingrained. But as the miles passed beneath their wheels, taking him closer to a reunion he'd never thought possible, the stories began to flow. Tales of jungle patrols and shared sea rations, of Tommy's talent for finding humor in the bleakest situations, of the night they'd sat on watch together and Tommy had confided his dreams for after the war, a teaching career, a family, a simple house with a garden. He loved growing things, Bill recalled, the memory surfacing with surprising clarity. Said his grandfather had taught him about plants, how to tell which wild ones were safe to eat. Saved our hides more than once when supplies ran low. As Bill spoke, the Tommy of his memories came alive, no longer frozen in that final terrible moment when Bill had believed him dead, but fully realized. A young man of courage, humor, and profound humanity. "He sounds like someone worth finding," Olivia said softly as Bill paused, his voice rough with emotion. "He was the best of us," Bill agreed. "Better than I ever was." By late afternoon, they crossed the Tennessee state line. The landscape had changed, mountains rising in the distance, the roads winding through valleys thick with trees beginning to show the first hints of autumn color. Olivia navigated carefully, following the directions she'd researched. Maplewood revealed itself as a small town nestled against the foothills of the Appalachians, the kind of close-knit community where newcomers were noticed and anonymity was a luxury not easily afforded. They checked into the only motel on the main street, a clean but dated establishment where the owner greeted them with polite curiosity. "Visiting family?" she inquired as she handed over the room keys. "An old friend," Bill replied, suddenly conscious of how little they actually knew about Tommy's current situation. Did he have family here? Was he well known in the community? Would their inquiry be met with welcome or suspicion? After settling into their adjoining rooms, they gathered in Bill's to finalize their plan. The VA office was closed for the weekend, but Olivia had arranged for a message to be passed to Thomas requesting a meeting the following day. "Now we wait," she said, closing her notebook. "They'll call the motel if he responds." Bill nodded, trying to contain his impatience. One more night after 55 years should be manageable, he told himself. Yet, as Ethan and Olivia left to find dinner, promising to bring something back for him, the waiting felt unbearable. He stepped outside onto the small balcony overlooking Maplewood's main street. The evening was settling in, lights coming on in shop windows, locals making their way home or gathering at what appeared to be the town's primary restaurant across the street. And then he saw him. An older man in a wheelchair, silver-haired but still broad-shouldered, was being assisted from a modified van into the restaurant entrance. Even from this distance, even after all these years, Bill recognized the profile, the set of the shoulders, the gesture of thanks to the young man helping him. Without conscious thought, Bill found himself moving down the exterior stairs of the motel, across the quiet street, toward the restaurant entrance. Some rational part of his mind screamed that this was impulsive, that they had a plan, that he should wait for Olivia and Ethan. But 55 years of waiting had suddenly become too much to bear for even one more minute. The restaurant door opened as Bill reached it, patrons exiting as he stood frozen on the threshold. Through the gap, he could see the silver-haired man now settled at a table near the window, smiling at a waitress who brought him a drink without being asked. Clearly a regular customer. Bill's hand moved to his breast pocket, feeling the outline of the dog tags through the fabric. This was the moment he had both longed for and dreaded. The culmination of a journey that had begun in the jungles of Vietnam and continued through decades of misplaced guilt and silent grief. With a deep breath, Bill Mitchell stepped through the door toward the friend he had mourned for over half a century. The friend who had been alive all along, whose memory had shaped Bill's life in ways neither of them could have imagined. "Tommy," he said, his voice barely audible above the restaurant's ambient noise. The silver-haired man looked up, confusion crossing his features for a moment before recognition dawned, slow at first. Then, with increasing certainty, "My God," Thomas Grayson whispered, the glass in his hand forgotten. "Bill, is that really you?" Time seemed to stop in the small-town restaurant as the two men regarded each other across decades of separation. Thomas Grayson's weathered face reflected the same shock Bill felt, recognition mixed with disbelief, joy shadowed by memories too painful to fully resurrect. "I thought you were dead," Bill said, his voice barely audible above the ambient restaurant noise. "For 55 years I thought I'd lost you in that jungle." Thomas gestured to the empty chair across from him. "Sit down before you fall down, Bill. You look like you've seen a ghost." Bill sank into the chair, his legs suddenly unreliable. Up close, Thomas's face was a road map of the intervening years. Deep lines around eyes that still held the same quick intelligence Bill remembered. Silver hair where once dark curls had peeked from beneath a helmet, skin burnished by decades of Tennessee sun. Yet beneath these changes, unmistakably, was the friend he had mourned for half a century. "How?" Bill managed, the single syllable containing a universe of questions. Thomas studied him with equal intensity, taking in the surgical bandage visible at Bill's collar, the trembling hands, the stunned expression. "That's a long story, one I thought you knew parts of." His tone held no accusation, just genuine puzzlement. "How did you find me after all this time?" Before Bill could form a response, the restaurant door opened, admitting Olivia and Ethan, who had clearly followed their grandfather's impulsive journey across the street. They approached the table cautiously, sensing the emotional gravity of the moment. "Grandpa?" Olivia's voice was gentle. "Is everything okay?" Bill turned, momentarily disoriented by their presence. "This is Thomas Grayson," he said, gesturing to the man across from him. "My friend from Vietnam, the one I told you about." Understanding dawned in Olivia's eyes. Ethan stepped forward, extending his hand to Thomas with military courtesy. "Sir, it's an honor to meet you. I'm Ethan Anderson, and this is my sister, Olivia. We're Bill's grandchildren." Thomas shook the offered hand, his expression softening. "Anderson grandchildren? Well, now that's something I never thought I'd see." He looked back at Bill. "You have a lot to catch up on, old friend." "And so do I, it seems." The waitress approached, sensing the unusual nature of the reunion. "Everything all right here, Tom?" she asked, her protective tone suggesting Thomas was more than just a regular customer. "Better than all right, Diane," Thomas replied with a smile that transformed his face, briefly revealing the young man Bill had known. "This here's Bill Anderson. We served together in Vietnam. Haven't seen each other since '68. Diane's professional demeanor melted into genuine warmth. "Well, that calls for a private table. Come on back to the garden room." "Nobody's booked it tonight?" With practiced efficiency, she helped Thomas maneuver his wheelchair away from the table. Bill noticed for the first time that both legs were missing below the knee, the empty space below Thomas's khaki pants, a stark reminder of all his friend had endured. The garden room proved to be a small, glass-enclosed space at the rear of the restaurant, offering both privacy and a view of a surprisingly lush garden illuminated by string lights. As they settled around the larger table, an awkward silence fell, the weight of unspoken questions hanging in the air. Olivia, sensing the need for a moment of privacy, stood. "Ethan and I will go get our things from the motel. We'll be back in a bit." She squeezed Bill's shoulder gently. "Take your time, Grandpa." After they left, Bill reached into his breast pocket and withdrew the handkerchief-wrapped dog tags, placing them carefully on the table between himself and Thomas. "These were inside me," he said without preamble. "Found during my surgery 3 days ago. They've been there since Vietnam." Thomas stared at the tags, recognition and confusion battling across his features. Slowly he reached out and unwrapped them, fingers tracing the embossed letters of his own name. "How was this possible?" he asked, looking up at Bill. "These were around my neck when the mortar hit." "I don't know," Bill admitted. "The doctor said my body created some kind of capsule around them. They'd been there for decades, along with a piece of shrapnel right here." He touched the bandage at the base of his neck. Thomas's expression shifted from confusion to dawning comprehension. "You were carrying me," he said slowly, "after I was hit. You must have been close enough to take shrapnel from the same blast." Bill nodded, fragments of memory surfacing with painful clarity. "You were bleeding so badly. I tried to stop it, but there was so much." His voice faltered. "The tags must have come loose. Maybe caught in my gear or clothing. I didn't notice. Was too focused on getting you to the medics." "And they told you I died," Thomas finished for him, understanding now. "They told you I didn't make it." "The corpsman said you were gone," Bill confirmed, the memory still sharp despite the decades. "I was injured too. Not badly, but they gave me morphine. Everything after that is blurry. When I asked later, they said you'd been given a military burial. I never questioned it." Thomas was silent for a long moment, absorbing this information. Then he reached into his own pocket and withdrew a worn leather wallet. From it, he extracted a carefully preserved photograph, the same group shot Bill had examined just days earlier. "I kept this all these years," Thomas said, placing it beside the dog tags, "carried it through the POW camp, through rehab at Walter Reed, through everything that came after. You were the reason I made it out alive, Bill. That's in all this time you thought I was dead. Bill stared at the photograph, the identical twin to the one in his desk drawer. I don't understand. Why didn't someone tell me you survived? There should have been notification, some record. Thomas sighed, rubbing a hand across his face. There was. At least I thought there was. He met Bill's gaze directly. I wrote to you, Bill. After I was repatriated in '73, once I was coherent enough to understand what had happened, the Red Cross helped me send letters to everyone from our unit I could remember, including you. Bill shook his head in bewilderment. I never received any letter. I would have remembered, would have moved heaven and earth to find you. The letters came back, Thomas continued. Not just yours, most of them. No forwarding address or recipient unknown. I figured you'd all moved on, maybe didn't want reminders of the war. Can't say I blamed you. That's impossible, Bill protested. I was in the same house from '72 until now, the same house I shared with Eleanor. At the mention of Eleanor's name, something shifted in Thomas's expression. A flicker of emotion Bill couldn't immediately identify. Eleanor, he repeated softly. How is she? The familiar pain of loss swept through Bill. She passed in '92. Cancer. Thomas closed his eyes briefly, genuine grief crossing his features. I'm sorry, Bill. Truly sorry. She was a special woman. The peculiarity of this response penetrated Bill's emotional fog. How would you know that? You never met Eleanor. We married after I came home. Thomas opened his eyes, meeting Bill's confused gaze with gentle resolve. I did know her, Bill. We corresponded for almost 20 years. The restaurant seemed to tilt around Bill, the revelation rearranging his understanding of his own life with the force of a seismic shift. That's not possible, he whispered. Eleanor would have told me. She wanted to, Thomas said quietly. Many times, according to her letters. But she respected your need to handle the war in your own way. He hesitated, then continued with careful gentleness. She found me in '74 after my name appeared in a newspaper article about returning POWs. Tracked me down through the VA hospital in Memphis where I was still doing rehab. Bill struggled to process this information, to reconcile it with the Eleanor he had known, his partner, his confidant, the woman with whom he had shared every aspect of his life. Except, he realized with dawning clarity, his deepest wounds from Vietnam, those he had kept carefully guarded, sharing only fragments even with her. Why would she keep this from me? He asked, the question directed as much at his absent wife as at Thomas. Her first letter explained it, Thomas replied. She wanted to understand what you'd been through, to find a way to help you heal. She hoped I might have insight she could use. He smiled faintly. What started as research became a friendship. We wrote every few months, Christmas cards, birthday greetings, updates on our lives. All without my knowledge, Bill said, an edge of bitterness creeping into his voice. Thomas regarded him steadily. She tried to tell you, Bill. In her last letter to me, she said she was going to insist you contact me, that she'd finally make you face what happened. That letter came about a month before I received the one telling me she'd passed. Bill's mind raced, connecting pieces of a puzzle he hadn't known existed. Eleanor's unusual insistence during her final weeks that he find peace about Tommy, her request, which he had dismissed as deathbed rambling, that he look in her desk drawer after she was gone, a request he had never fulfilled, unable to face the finality it represented. She wrote me a letter, Thomas continued when Bill remained silent, to be delivered in case she didn't have a chance to tell you herself. Asked me to wait a reasonable time before contacting you, to give you space to grieve. His expression softened with remembered affection. That was Eleanor. always thinking of everyone else's needs, even at the end. I never looked in her desk, Bill admitted, shame washing over him. After she passed, I couldn't bring myself to go through her things. Sarah, Jessica, did most of it. He paused, a new thought striking him. Jessica, did she know about you? Thomas shook his head. Eleanor never mentioned involving her. Said it was between you and me, and she was just the bridge until you were ready to cross it yourself. Bill fell silent, overwhelmed by the implications. For 20 years, Eleanor had maintained this secret connection, hoping to heal a wound he had refused to acknowledge. And after her death, Thomas had honored her wishes, waiting for a contact that never came because Bill had been too paralyzed by grief to fulfill her final request. The letter must still be there, he said finally, in her desk after all these years. Probably, Thomas agreed, along with copies of some of mine. Eleanor mentioned keeping them. He hesitated, then added gently, "She loved you very much, Bill. Everything she did was out of that love." Bill nodded, unable to speak past the constriction in his throat. Of course it had been love. Eleanor's every action had been guided by her fierce commitment to his well-being, even when he resisted her efforts. Even it seemed when that commitment led her to maintain a secret he might have viewed as betrayal had he discovered it while she lived. She was right, Bill finally managed, about everything. About my need to face what happened with you, about the burden being too heavy to carry alone. He touched the bandage on his neck, literally and figuratively, as it turns out. Thomas smiled, the expression transforming his weathered face. Eleanor had a way of being right about most things. Reminded me of my Catherine that way. Catherine? Bill repeated, memory stirring. My wife of 48 years now, Thomas said with evident pride. She was my physical therapist at Walter Reed, refused to let me wallow in self-pity, said if I could survive a POW camp I could damn well learn to walk on prosthetics. A connection formed in Bill's mind. The young man who helped you from the van? My grandson, Thomas Jr., Thomas confirmed. Though everyone calls him TJ, he looks after his old grandpa, makes sure I get out of the house regularly. Pride shone in his eyes. Marine Corps just finished his second tour in Afghanistan. Made it home in one piece, thank the Lord. The parallels between their lives, grandchildren named after the other, military service continuing into the next generation, struck Bill with poignant force. Their paths, divergent for so long, contained these unexpected symmetries, as if some cosmic hand had maintained connections despite the physical separation. Ethan's enlisting, Bill said. After graduation next spring, following in footsteps he doesn't fully understand. Thomas nodded, comprehension in his gaze. Our legacy, for better or worse. We can only hope they find better wars than we did. He paused, then asked the question that had clearly been waiting since Bill's appearance. How did you find me, Bill, after all this time? Bill explained about the surgery, the discovery of the dog tags, and Olivia's research through the VA. As he spoke, Thomas listened with unwavering attention, occasionally nodding or asking clarifying questions. So, your body literally preserved a piece of our shared past, Thomas marveled when Bill finished, and your granddaughter used it to bring us together. If that's not divine intervention, I don't know what is. Bill had never been a religious man, but in that moment, he found it difficult to dismiss Thomas's interpretation. The improbability of it all, the tags remaining within him for decades, the surgical discovery, the series of events leading to this restaurant in Tennessee, suggested a pattern beyond mere coincidence. There's something else you should know, Thomas said, his tone shifting slightly. Something Eleanor asked me to tell you if we ever met again. Bill braced himself, unsure what further revelations this night might hold. "She knew about what happened that day," Thomas continued carefully. "The real reason you've carried such guilt all these years. About sending me to check the eastern perimeter while you took the west." Bill stiffened, his breath catching. This was the secret he had kept even from Eleanor. The decision that had placed Thomas directly in harm's way, the source of his deepest guilt. "How could she know?" he whispered. "Because I told her," Thomas replied simply, "in my letters, about how that decision saved my life rather than endangering it." He leaned forward, intensity in his gaze. "Bill, if you had gone east and I had gone west, neither of us would be sitting here now. The second mortar hit exactly where you would have been. The only reason you survived was because you weren't there." Bill stared at him, struggling to recalibrate decades of guilt against this new information. "But you were captured, tortured, lost your legs, and lived," Thomas countered firmly. "Came home to Catherine, had 3 children, now 7 grandchildren, built a life." He gestured to his missing legs. "These were a high price, yes, but not compared to the alternative." The weight of this revelation pressed against Bill's chest, simultaneously crushing and liberating. The guilt that had formed the foundation of his post-war identity was based on a fundamental misunderstanding. The decision he had punished himself for had not condemned his friend, but saved them both, albeit in drastically different ways. "I don't know how to process this," Bill admitted, his voice unsteady. "It's too much." Thomas reached across the table, his hand covering Bill's with surprising strength. "You don't have to process it all tonight, old friend. We have time now. Something I never thought we'd have again." The restaurant door opened, admitting Olivia and Ethan, who approached the table with cautious expressions, clearly uncertain whether they were interrupting. "Everything okay, Grandpa?" Olivia asked, her gaze taking in the dog tags and photograph on the table, the emotional intensity evident in both men's faces. Bill looked at his grandchildren, these extensions of himself and Eleanor, these bridges to a future he had nearly refused to fully participate in, and felt a surge of gratitude so intense it bordered on pain. "Better than okay," he replied, his voice steadier now. "Come meet your honorary great-uncle Thomas properly. Seems he and your grandmother were quite the pen pals." As Olivia and Ethan joined them, Bill watched Thomas engage with his grandchildren, answering Ethan's respectful questions about Vietnam with gentle candor, responding to Olivia's medical inquiries about his prosthetics with good-humored patience. This, Bill realized, was part of what Eleanor had hoped for all along. Not just reconciliation between old friends, but the extension of that healing into the next generation. The evening stretched into night as they talked, decades of separation dissolving in the warmth of reconnection. Thomas shared stories of his life after repatriation, the grueling rehabilitation, the return to college on the GI Bill, his career as a high school history teacher, the family that had sustained him through it all. "Catherine's at her sister's in Knoxville this weekend," he explained. "She'll be spitting mad she missed you. Been hearing about Bill Anderson for 50 years. Bill, in turn, spoke of his construction business, of Jessica's nursing career, of Eleanor's garden that he had tried and largely failed to maintain after her passing. With each shared memory, each exchanged photograph pulled from wallets, each moment of laughter or solemn understanding, the outline of their separate lives became clearer, lives that had continued in parallel despite the gulf of misunderstanding between them. As the restaurant staff began closing procedures around them, Thomas reached into his pocket and withdrew an envelope, worn at the edges and yellowed with age. "I've carried this since 1992, he said, placing it before Bill. "Eleanor's last letter to me. She asked me to give it to you when we met again." A smile touched his lips. "She never doubted we would, sooner or later." Bill stared at the envelope, Eleanor's distinctive handwriting addressing it to Thomas Grayson, friend and brother in arms. His hands trembled slightly as he picked it up, this last message from a wife 30 years gone. "Should I?" he began, uncertain whether to open it now or in private. "That's between you and Eleanor," Thomas said gently. "But I can tell you it brought me comfort when I needed it most. Might do the same for you." The restaurant manager approached, apologetic but firm about the late hour. Thomas nodded in understanding. "We've kept these good people well past closing," he said. "Time to call it a night. We have rooms at the motel," Olivia offered, "just across the street." "And I have a perfectly good house with plenty of space," Thomas countered. "Just 5 minutes from here. Catherine would skin me alive if I let you stay anywhere else." The decision was made without further discussion. Ethan helped gather Thomas's wheelchair while Olivia collected the precious items from the table. Dog tags, photograph, and the newly delivered letter, carefully wrapping them in the handkerchief Bill had used to carry the tags. As they prepared to leave, Bill found himself face to face with Thomas once more, the reality of their reunion still surreal despite the hours of conversation. "I still can't believe you're alive," he admitted, "that we're sitting here talking after all this time." Thomas's expression softened. 55 years is a long time to carry a ghost, Bill. For both of us." He gestured to Bill's neck. "Some burdens leave marks we can see. Others don't, but they all need to be set down eventually." Bill nodded, understanding the deeper truth in his friend's words. The mass that had grown within him, physical manifestation of trauma carried too long, had finally yielded its secrets, just as the emotional burdens he had borne were now being revealed, examined, and gradually lightened. As they left the restaurant, stepping into the quiet Tennessee night, Bill felt Eleanor's presence with startling clarity, not as a ghost or supernatural visitation, but as the culmination of her life's work on his behalf. She had known somehow that this moment would come, had prepared for it even as she faced her own mortality, had never stopped believing in the healing power of truth and connection, even when Bill himself had lost faith. The letter in his pocket seemed to pulse with her energy, this final communication across the divide of years and death. Whatever it contained, Bill knew it represented Eleanor's last gift to him, a bridge not just to Thomas, but to the peace she had always wanted for him. Under the canopy of stars, surrounded by family both old and newly discovered, Bill Anderson felt the first genuine stirrings of that peace, fragile yet persistent, like spring growth after the longest winter. Thomas Grayson's home sat on 2 acres at the edge of Maplewood, a modest ranch-style house with wheelchair-accessible modifications and a sprawling garden that wrapped around 3 sides. Even in the darkness, Bill could make out raised planting beds and trellises heavy with late-season vegetables. "Catherine's domain," Thomas explained as Ethan helped him navigate the ramp to the front porch. "Woman could grow roses in concrete. Says working the earth keeps her sane after 40 years of dealing with stubborn patients like me." Inside, the house was warm and lived in with comfortable furniture arranged to accommodate Thomas's wheelchair. Family photos crowded every surface, children at various ages, graduation portraits, wedding pictures, and a growing collection of grandchildren. Bill felt a pang, thinking of his own sparse walls at home, the family photos Eleanor had displayed that he'd gradually moved to drawers and closets after her death, unable to bear their silent witness to his isolation. After showing them to guest rooms, Catherine insists on keeping 2 ready at all times. You never know when someone might need a place. Thomas suggested they all get some rest. "Tomorrow's soon enough for the rest of our catching up," he said, though his eyes lingered on the envelope Bill still carried. Sleep, however, proved elusive for Bill. The day's revelations swirled in his mind, each one demanding attention. Thomas alive. Eleanor's secret correspondence. The decision that had saved Bill's life rather than endangered Thomas's. The dog tags preserved within his own flesh for decades. It was too much to process. Too many foundations of his life suddenly revealed as built on misunderstanding. Around 2 a.m., Bill gave up on sleep and made his way to the kitchen for water. He found Thomas already there, sitting at the table with a pot of tea, as if he'd been waiting. "Never could sleep worth a damn after 68, Thomas said by way of greeting. Even Catherine gave up trying to cure that particular affliction. He nodded to a chair. "Tea? Or there's bourbon if you prefer. I keep a bottle for medicinal purposes." "Bourbon," Bill said, easing himself into the offered seat. His surgical sight ached from the day's travel and emotion, a physical reminder of all that had changed. Thomas poured 2 fingers of amber liquid into a glass and slid it across the table. "Two old friends," he said, raising his own teacup in toast. "Found again against all odds." Bill took a sip, the familiar burn steadying him. "I keep thinking I'm going to wake up back in Georgia and find this was all some anesthesia-induced dream." "If it is, we're sharing it," Thomas said with a wry smile. "And I've had enough strange dreams since Vietnam to know the difference." They sat in companionable silence for a moment, 2 old soldiers who had seen too much, lost too much, and found each other again in the most improbable of ways. "You haven't opened Eleanor's letter," Thomas observed finally. Bill's hand went to his shirt pocket where the envelope rested. "Not sure I'm ready." "Eleanor always did know how to cut right to the heart of things," Thomas said, "even in her letters to me. No pretense, no dancing around hard truths." He took a sip of tea. "Scared the hell out of me sometimes, her clarity. Reminded me there was no hiding from what happened, only walking through it." "She tried to get me to talk about the war," Bill admitted. "For years, she tried. I thought I was protecting her by keeping the worst of it to myself." "We all did," Thomas said. "Thought we were being noble, sparing our loved ones. Turns out we were just building walls that kept us isolated in our own pain." He gestured to his missing legs. "Took me losing these to learn that lesson. Hard way to come by wisdom." "How did you do it?" Bill asked, the question that had been forming since he first saw Thomas at the restaurant. "How did you come back from everything? The jungle, the POW camp, the injuries. How did you build a life after all that?" Thomas considered the question, his gaze drifting to the window where the night pressed against the glass. "One day at a time, like everyone says. It's a cliché because it's true." He smiled faintly. "And I had help. Catherine, who wouldn't let me wallow. My faith, which I'd lost in that camp and found again in the hospital. And Eleanor's letters, reminding me that you were out there somewhere, living a life worth hearing about." "I wasn't living much of a life," Bill confessed. "Not really. Building a business, going through the motions. Even with Eleanor and Jessica, there was always this distance, this part of me that never came home from Vietnam." "The part you were carrying on your back all these years," Thomas said quietly. Bill nodded, understanding the metaphor's literal truth. "The mass started growing after Eleanor died, 1995. I saw it in the mirror one morning and heard her voice telling me to get it checked. Ignored it, of course." "Of course," Thomas echoed with a sad smile. "What's a little tumor between friends?" Bill took another sip of bourbon. "Olivia thinks there might be some kind of psychological component, that my body was physically manifesting trauma I couldn't process emotionally." "Smart girl, your granddaughter," Thomas said. "Reminds me of Eleanor in that way too, seeing connections others miss. She wants to study it, the phenomenon. Says it could help other veterans." Bill shook his head. "Can you imagine? Something good coming from all this?" "I can," Thomas said simply. "After everything else that's happened, why not that too?" The conversation lulled again, both men lost in their thoughts, the quiet kitchen a safe harbor for words unspoken for too long. "You should call Jessica," Thomas said eventually. "She'll be worried about you, traveling so soon after surgery." Bill grimaced. "She's going to be furious I came without telling her." "She's going to be furious about a lot more than that once she learns everything," Thomas pointed out. "Might as well get the lecture over with." Bill couldn't argue with that logic. The thought of explaining to his daughter not just his impulsive journey, but all he'd discovered about her mother's secret correspondence was daunting. Yet it had to be done. The time for keeping secrets was over. "First thing tomorrow," he promised. "After I've had a chance to read Eleanor's letter. Need to know what I'm walking into." Thomas nodded, understanding. "Fair enough." He hesitated, then added, "Whatever's in that letter, Bill, remember it was written from love. Eleanor never did anything that wasn't motivated by love." "I know," Bill said, and he did. Whatever shock or pain the letter might contain, he had no doubt of its underlying purpose. Eleanor had always been his compass, pointing toward healing, even when he'd stubbornly marched in the opposite direction. As they finished their drinks, Thomas shared stories of his family, his 3 children and their careers, his grandchildren's accomplishments, the yearly reunions that filled this house with noise and laughter. Bill listened, envious of the easy closeness Thomas described, but grateful his friend had found such happiness after all he'd endured. "You'll meet them all eventually," Thomas promised. "Catherine will insist on it once she knows you're here. She's been curious about you for decades." The thought of being enfolded into this large, loving family was both appealing and terrifying to Bill. He had kept his world so small for so long, limited to Jessica and the twins, and even with them maintaining emotional distance. The prospect of wider connections, of being known by more people, carried risks he wasn't sure he was ready for. Thomas seemed to read his hesitation. "One step at a time, old friend. We've already had more miracles today than most people get in a lifetime." Around 4 a.m., they finally returned to their rooms, though Bill suspected neither would sleep much before dawn. As he settled back onto the unfamiliar bed, the envelope from Eleanor seemed to burn against his chest, demanding attention. Bill took it out and studied it in the dim light filtering through the curtains. The paper had yellowed with age, the creases soft with repeated folding and unfolding, evidence that Thomas had read it many times over the years. Eleanor's handwriting was achingly familiar, though shakier than her usual confident script. She must have written it near the end, when the pain medications made her hands tremble. With a deep breath, Bill carefully opened the envelope and unfolded the pages within. "My dearest Bill," Eleanor had written, "if you're reading this, 2 things have happened. I've left this world before you, which I always suspected would be the case, stubborn man that you are, and you finally found your way back to Thomas. I'm grateful for both, though the first brings me sorrow for your sake." The letter continued for several pages, Eleanor's handwriting growing shakier toward the end, but her thoughts remaining clear and purposeful. She explained her correspondence with Thomas, her reasons for keeping it private, her hopes that Bill would eventually find the peace that had eluded him since Vietnam. "I never saw this as a betrayal of your confidence," she had written. "Rather, it was my attempt to understand the war that came home with you, to find ways to help you heal wounds too deep for either of us to reach alone. Thomas's friendship has been a gift, helping me support you better than I could have otherwise. I only regret that my courage failed me in telling you sooner." Bill's vision blurred as he read, tears gathering and falling onto the aged paper. He could hear Eleanor's voice in every word, her practical wisdom, her unfailing compassion, her fierce love. The final paragraph brought him to his knees. "Find him, Bill. Complete the circle that was broken in that jungle, not for Thomas's sake, nor even for mine, but for your own. The heaviest burdens are those we carry alone, and you've been alone with this one far too long. I have loved you through your silences, your nightmares, your determined solitude. Now I ask you to love yourself enough to lay down these burdens at last. Your Eleanor. Bill sat motionless, the letter trembling in his hands, overwhelmed by the gift his wife had given him, the permission to heal, the path to reconnection, the wisdom to recognize what he truly needed. All orchestrated decades ago by a woman who knew him better than he knew himself. Morning found him still awake, watching the sunrise through the guest room window, Eleanor's letter carefully refolded and returned to its envelope. He felt hollowed out, scraped clean of the calcified grief and guilt that had been his constant companions for so long. In their place was something fragile but growing. Not quite peace, not yet, but its precursor. The possibility of peace. The smell of coffee drew him to the kitchen, where he found Olivia already seated at the table with Thomas, deep in conversation about the medical implications of Bill's unusual condition. The tissue formed a complete biological encapsulation, Olivia was saying, her hands gesturing enthusiastically. It's like nothing in the medical literature I've read. The closest analogy would be how the body walls off foreign objects with fibrous tissue, but this was much more sophisticated. A protective environment that preserved the metal from oxidation. Thomas nodded, seeming genuinely interested despite the early hour and technical discussion. Like amber preserving insects for millions of years, he suggested. Yes, exactly. Olivia's face lit up at the comparison. But created by living tissue, Grandpa's body wasn't rejecting the tags, it was safeguarding them. Bill paused in the doorway, struck by the metaphor. His body had indeed preserved what his mind couldn't bear to face, physical evidence of the friendship he'd believed lost forever. "Morning, you two," he said, entering the kitchen. "Solving all the medical mysteries of the world already?" Olivia turned, assessing him with her clinical gaze. "You didn't sleep," she accused. "Your surgical site will take longer to heal if you don't rest properly." "I'll rest when I'm dead," Bill replied, the old phrase automatic. Then, seeing her frown, he softened. "I had some reading to do." He patted his pocket where Eleanor's letter rested. Understanding dawned in Olivia's eyes. "Grandma's letter?" Bill nodded, not trusting his voice. "Coffee's fresh," Thomas said, smoothly changing the subject. "And Ethan's gone for breakfast. Boy was up at dawn, said he spotted a diner on Main Street last night." Bill poured himself a cup, grateful for Thomas's intuitive understanding of when to press and when to grant space. It was a skill Eleanor had possessed as well. As he took his first sip, his cell phone rang, Jessica's ringtone. Bill glanced at the clock, realizing it was later than he'd thought. Almost 9. His daughter would definitely be worried by now. "Morning, Jess," he answered, trying to sound casual. "Where the hell are you?" Jessica's voice was tight with concern and anger. "I stopped by the house to check on you and you're gone. No note, no message. I've been calling for hours." Bill winced. In the emotional upheaval of yesterday, he'd forgotten to charge his phone. "I'm sorry, Jess, I should have called. I'm in Tennessee." "Tennessee?" The word emerged as a near screech. "You had surgery 3 days ago. Dr. Wilson specifically said no traveling for at least 2 weeks. "Olivia and Ethan are with me," Bill said, as if that mitigated the recklessness of the journey. "We're fine. Better than fine, actually. Jess, I found him. Thomas Grayson." "He's alive." The silence on the other end stretched so long Bill wondered if they'd been disconnected. "The soldier from your letter?" Jessica finally asked, her voice quieter now. "The one whose dog tags were in the tumor?" "Yes. We're at his house in Maplewood. Jess, there's so much to tell you. About Tommy. About Mom." "Mom?" Jessica interrupted, confusion evident. What does Mom have to do with this? Bill took a deep breath, sensing he was about to drop a bombshell on his daughter's understanding of her own mother. She knew Thomas. They corresponded for years after she found out he was alive. She never told me. Another long silence. Bill could almost hear Jessica processing this revelation, recalibrating her understanding of her parents' marriage. That doesn't make sense, she said finally. Mom told me everything. She would have mentioned something this important. Not everything, apparently, Bill said, a hint of the bitterness he'd felt last night creeping into his voice. Thomas has letters going back to 1974. They wrote regularly until she died. I need to see this for myself, Jessica said decisively. I'm coming there. Jess, it's a 7-hour drive. I'll be there by dinner, she cut him off. Text me the address. The line went dead. Bill looked at the phone, then at Thomas and Olivia, who had clearly been listening to his side of the conversation. Jessica's coming, he said unnecessarily. I gathered that, Thomas replied with a small smile. Catherine will be delighted. The more the merrier, she always says. She's upset, Bill said, feeling the need to apologize in advance for whatever storm his daughter might bring with her. She has every right to be, Thomas said reasonably. You disappeared after major surgery to visit a man she's never heard of, then told her her mother kept secrets for decades. I'd be upset too. Put that way, Bill could hardly argue. He had upended Jessica's world in a 3-minute phone call. Of course, she needed to see the evidence for herself, to meet Thomas, to understand what had been hidden from both of them for so long. Ethan returned with bags of breakfast sandwiches and a cardboard tray of coffee just as Bill was finishing his call. The young man's military efficiency had extended to civilian life. He'd remembered everyone's preferences without being told. As they ate, Bill's anxiety about Jessica's impending arrival grew. His daughter had inherited Eleanor's compassion, but also his own stubbornness. Once she felt blindsided or betrayed, she could be formidable in her anger. And she would undoubtedly feel both when she learned the full extent of what her mother had kept from them. Maybe I should go back to the motel, Bill suggested after breakfast. Give Jessica time to process everything when she arrives. Thomas shook his head firmly. Running never solved anything, Bill. Believe me, I tried it enough times after coming home. Catherine had to drag me back from the edge more than once. He looked at Bill with the steady gaze of someone who had faced his own demons and survived. Whatever Jessica brings with her, anger, confusion, hurt, it's better faced head-on, together. Bill knew his friend was right, but the prospect of confrontation with his daughter made his newly healed neck throb with tension. She's going to have questions I don't have answers for. Then we'll find them together, Thomas said simply. That's what family does. The word family lingered in the air, its implications expanding to include not just Bill's blood relations, but Thomas and his household as well. The boundaries between their separate lives were already blurring, healing the rift that had kept them apart for over 5 decades. As the day progressed, Bill found himself alternately anxious about Jessica's arrival and deeply grateful for Thomas's presence. They spent the morning in Thomas's study, looking through old photographs and letters, filling in the gaps of each other's lives. Olivia and Ethan gave them space, exploring the grounds in town, returning with tales of the local diner where everyone seemed to know and respect Mr. Tom. Thomas's status in Maplewood became clearer as neighbors dropped by throughout the day, ostensibly to borrow tools or share garden produce, but clearly curious about the visitors. Each was introduced to Bill with the same simple explanation. My friend from Vietnam. We served together. The words were spoken with such natural pride that Bill felt a warm glow of belonging each time. Around noon, Thomas received a call from Catherine checking in from her sisters in Knoxville. Bill could hear her excited voice through the speaker as Thomas explained the miraculous reunion. "Don't you dare let him leave before I get back tomorrow," she insisted. "I've been waiting 50 years to meet this man." "Wouldn't dream of it, Katie," Thomas assured her, a softness in his voice that spoke volumes about their relationship. Besides, his daughter's driving in from Georgia today. Might be a bit of a situation. She didn't know about Eleanor's letters. Catherine's response was immediate and practical. "Guest rooms made up. I'll bring extra groceries when I come home." And Thomas, her voice lowered, though Bill could still hear her, "Give them space to work through this. Some revelations take time to settle." "Yes, ma'am," Thomas replied with mock solemnity. "Still telling me what to do after all these years?" "Someone has to," Catherine retorted, affection evident in her tone. "Love you, old soldier." "Love you too. Drive safe tomorrow." As Thomas ended the call, Bill felt a pang of envy for the easy intimacy the couple shared, the kind he and Eleanor had been building before cancer stole their future together. "Catherine sounds remarkable," he said. "She is," Thomas agreed. "Saved my life in more ways than one. Wouldn't have made it through those first years without her." He smiled at a private memory. "She used to say she fell in love with my stubbornness first. Said any man who'd survive a POW camp and then argue with his physical therapist about proper stretching technique had the kind of fighting spirit she wanted on her team." The conversation meandered through the afternoon, punctuated by shared meals and quiet moments of reflection. Thomas showed Bill his workshop behind the house, where he crafted intricate wooden toys for his grandchildren and local charity auctions. "Keeps my hands busy," he explained, "and my mind focused on creating instead of destroying. Therapy, Catherine calls it." Bill examined the detailed craftsmanship of a miniature rocking horse, marveling at the precision of the work. "Eleanor tried to get me into woodworking after I retired," he admitted. "Bought me a lathe and everything. It's still sitting in the garage, never been used." "It's never too late to start," Thomas said, running his hand over a half-finished toy train. "That's another thing Catherine keeps telling me, old dogs, new tricks, and all that." The day slipped by in this gentle rhythm of conversation and companionable silence, the decades-long gap in their friendship gradually filling with shared stories and renewed understanding. By late afternoon, Bill felt more at ease than he had in years, despite the looming confrontation with Jessica. When the crunch of tires on gravel announced a car in the driveway, Bill tensed. Thomas reached over and squeezed his shoulder. "Remember," he said quietly, "whatever happens, you're not alone in this anymore." Bill nodded, drawing strength from his friend's steady presence. Together they moved to the front of the house to meet Jessica's arrival, ready to face whatever storm she might bring with her. Jessica Anderson stepped from her car, exhaustion and tension evident in the rigid set of her shoulders. At 45, she was the perfect blend of her parents, Eleanor's auburn hair now streaked with silver, Bill's determined jaw, and a gaze that could cut through pretense with surgical precision. Her nurse's scrubs had been replaced by jeans and a faded UGA sweatshirt, suggesting she'd left directly from her shift at the hospital. "Dad?" she said, her voice carefully neutral as she approached the porch where Bill and Thomas waited. Her eyes moved to Thomas in his wheelchair, assessing him with professional detachment before softening slightly. "You must be Thomas Grayson." "Just Tommy to friends," he replied with a warm smile, extending his hand. "You look just like your mother around the eyes. She'd be proud to see you now." Jessica's composure faltered momentarily at this casual reference to Eleanor. She accepted the handshake, studying Thomas with renewed intensity. "You really did know her." "For 20 years, Thomas confirmed. "Never met in person, but I'd recognize Eleanor's spirit anywhere. She had a way of making herself known, even through letters." Jessica nodded, a complex emotion crossing her features. "She did." Her gaze returned to Bill. "You look pale, Dad. Should you be up?" The question was loaded, both genuine concern and subtle accusation. Bill recognized the tone from a lifetime of father-daughter negotiations. "I'm fine, Jess. Surgery site's healing well. Just tired." "Because you drove 7 hours 3 days after major surgery," she retorted, the professional nurse momentarily overriding the daughter. "Against explicit medical advice." "Your father's in good hands here," Thomas interjected smoothly. "We've got him under constant surveillance." Between Olivia's medical knowledge and my experience as a professional patient, he doesn't stand a chance of overdoing it. The gentle humor seemed to diffuse some of Jessica's tension. She managed a small smile. "Where are the twins?" "Inside," Bill answered. "Ethan's been helping Thomas with some project in the workshop, and Olivia's been glued to medical journals since we arrived. Come in, Jess. We've got a lot to talk about." The interior of Thomas's home, with its comfortable lived-in feel, seemed to further disarm Jessica. She greeted Olivia and Ethan with quick hugs before accepting the coffee Catherine had left prepared in a thermal carafe. "I've been driving since noon," she admitted, settling onto the sofa. "Had to reschedule 3 home visits and call in favors at the hospital. This better be worth it." "It is," Olivia assured her, her enthusiasm bubbling over. "Mom, the medical implications alone are incredible." Grandpa's body created a biological preservation system around the dog tags that— "Later, Liv," Jessica interrupted gently. "I need to understand the basics first." She turned to Bill, who had taken the armchair across from her. "Start at the beginning, Dad. All of it." Bill exchanged glances with Thomas, who nodded encouragement. Taking a deep breath, Bill began the story. The surgery, the discovery of the dog tags, Olivia's research, the journey to Tennessee, and the reunion with Thomas. As he spoke, Jessica listened intently, her expression shifting between amazement, confusion, and something harder to define. "So Tommy wasn't dead," she said, when Bill paused. "He was a POW, then came home, and no one told you." "His repatriation would have been in the news," Bill acknowledged. "But in '73, I was focused on building the business, preparing for your arrival." "Vietnam was something I was trying to put behind me. The Army sent notices to the last known addresses they had," Thomas added. "Most of us had moved on by then, and with my injuries, identification was complicated. It was months before I was coherent enough to reach out myself." Jessica nodded, processing this. "But Mom found you," she said to Thomas, "in '74. "Yes," Thomas confirmed, "after an article about returning POWs appeared in a national magazine. She tracked me down through the VA hospital in Memphis, wrote me a letter introducing herself as Bill's wife, asking if I'd help her understand what he'd been through." "And you never told Dad about this correspondence?" It wasn't a question. "Eleanor asked me not to at first," Thomas said carefully. "She felt Bill wasn't ready to face those memories. Said he'd built walls around that part of his life, and pushing too hard might do more harm than good. So instead, you two maintained a secret relationship for 2 decades. Jessica's voice had taken on an edge. "Behind his back." "It wasn't like that, Jess," Bill intervened, hearing the implication in her tone. "Tommy and Eleanor weren't— It wasn't romantic. They were friends. She was trying to help me in her way." "By lying to you?" Jessica's protective instinct flared. "By going behind your back to talk about you with someone you thought was dead?" "By trying to understand a part of me I wouldn't let her see," Bill corrected gently. "Your mother never did anything that wasn't motivated by love, Jess. You know that." Jessica's gaze dropped to her coffee cup. "I thought I knew a lot of things." She looked up at Thomas. "Did she ever intend to tell him? Or was this supposed to be a lifelong secret?" "She was planning to tell him," Thomas replied. "Her last letter to me, before she passed, said she was going to insist Bill contact me, that she'd finally make him face what happened. But then the cancer progressed faster than expected," Bill added quietly. "And instead, She left letters for Tommy to keep until we found each other, and one for me in her desk drawer. Jessica's head snapped up. What letter in her desk drawer? Bill felt a cold certainty settle in his stomach. She asked me to look in her desk after she was gone. I never did. Couldn't face it. He studied his daughter's expression. You cleaned out her desk? Jessica nodded slowly. There was a sealed envelope with your name on it. I put it with her other papers in the box in your closet. Her voice had grown very quiet. You never opened that box either, did you? No, Bill admitted, shame washing over him. I couldn't. A heavy silence filled the room. Even Olivia and Ethan, who had been listening quietly from the kitchen doorway, seemed to hold their breath. All these years, Jessica finally said, Mom's letter was sitting in that box in your closet, and Thomas was carrying another one, waiting for the moment you'd find each other. She shook her head, a mix of wonder and exasperation. And it took a tumor with dog tags inside it to finally bring everything to light. The body keeps the score, Olivia murmured, quoting a book on trauma she'd been reading. Literally in Grandpa's case. Jessica turned to her daughter. You knew about this before the surgery? The connection to Thomas? Olivia shook her head. No one knew until Dr. Wilson found the tags, but I suspected the mass had psychological origins. The location, the timing of its appearance after Grandma died, it fit the pattern of somatization. Physical manifestation of psychological trauma, Jessica translated, her nurse's training evident. She looked back at Bill. And now? The mass is gone, you've found Thomas, read Mom's letter to him? What happens next? It was the question Bill had been asking himself since the moment in the restaurant when he'd first recognized Thomas. What did happen next? How did one rebuild a life at 78, when so many of its foundations had been revealed as illusions? I don't know, he admitted. I'm still trying to process all of this, but I know I can't go back to the way things were. Thomas leaned forward in his wheelchair. Catherine's coming home tomorrow, he said. She's been wanting to meet Bill for decades, and then there's the letter in your closet, Jessica, the one Eleanor left for Bill. You should read it, Dad, Jessica said softly, her earlier anger seemingly replaced by compassion. Whatever Mom wanted to tell you, she felt it was important enough to write down when she knew she was dying. Bill nodded, the prospect both terrifying and necessary. I will. When we get home. If you're up to it, Thomas suggested carefully, Catherine and I would love to have you all stay a few days, give you time to absorb everything before the long drive back. Jessica hesitated, clearly torn between her professional concern for her father's recovery and the recognition that something profound was happening here. I'd need to make some calls, she said finally. Arrange coverage for my patients. And I've got lab hours, Olivia added, but I could skip Friday's lecture. West Point can spare me until Sunday, Ethan said with a grin. They practically pushed me out the door for this leave. They were all looking at Bill now, waiting for his decision. The weight of their expectation should have felt burdensome, but instead, he found it strangely buoyant, the feeling of being connected, being part of something larger than his own isolation. I'd like to stay, he said simply. If Tommy and Catherine will have us. Settled then, Thomas declared with obvious pleasure. Now, I suggest we all get some rest. It's been an emotional day, and Catherine will have us all running ragged tomorrow once she arrives. That woman has the energy of someone half her age and twice as many legs. The self-deprecating humor broke the remaining tension. Even Jessica managed a genuine smile. As the group dispersed to their respective rooms, Bill found himself alone with his daughter for the first time since her arrival. Are you really okay, Dad? She asked, the professional nurse momentarily set aside. Physically, I mean. The surgery site looks good, but you've been through a lot. I'm sore, Bill admitted, but better than I've been in years. He met her gaze directly. "I'm sorry I didn't tell you about coming here. It was impulsive." "Impulsive isn't a word I'd normally associate with you," Jessica observed wryly. "You're usually the king of careful planning." "Maybe that's been the problem," Bill said. "Too much caution, too little living." He gestured toward Thomas's house, with its evidence of a life fully engaged. "Tommy lost both legs and spent 5 years in a POW camp. And look what he built." Jessica studied him, seeming to truly see him for the first time in years. "You've changed," she said finally. "In just a few days, you've changed." "Having a tumor removed from your spine will do that," Bill joked weakly. "It's more than that." Jessica shook her head. "It's like you've been carrying the weight of Tommy's death for so long, you forgot how to stand upright. And now that weight's gone." The insight struck Bill with its accuracy. "Your mother used to say something similar, that I'd built my life around an absence, the space where Tommy should have been." "Mom was pretty smart," Jessica said with a sad smile. "The smartest," Bill agreed. "I just wish I'd listened to her sooner." Jessica reached out and squeezed his hand, a rare moment of physical connection between them. "Maybe this is exactly when you were supposed to hear her message. Maybe it couldn't have happened any sooner." Bill considered this possibility, that the timing of all these revelations was not random, but somehow perfectly orchestrated, that his body had kept Tommy's tags safe until he was ready to face the truth they represented. "Get some sleep, Jess," he said, returning the squeeze. "Tomorrow's likely to be another emotional day." With Mom's friend Catherine arriving, Jessica raised an eyebrow. "I'm looking forward to meeting the woman who's been married to Thomas for 48 years. She must be quite something." "From what Tommy says, she's a force of nature," Bill replied with a smile. "Reminds me of someone else I knew." Jessica nodded, understanding the reference to Eleanor. "Good night, Dad." She hesitated, then added, "I'm glad you found him. Whatever else comes of this, I'm glad you know the truth." After she left, Bill sat alone in the guest room, contemplating the day's events. Jessica's arrival had gone better than he'd feared, though he sensed she was still processing the revelations about her mother. The knowledge that Eleanor's final letter to him had been sitting in a box in his closet all these years weighed heavily. What other messages from his wife had he missed by closing himself off to the pain of her absence? A soft knock at the door interrupted his thoughts. Thomas wheeled himself in at Bill's invitation, carrying 2 glasses of bourbon. "Thought you might need this," he said, offering one to Bill. "Family reunions can be exhausting, even when they go well." Bill accepted the drink gratefully. "It went better than I expected." "Jess has every right to be angry." "She's more confused than angry, I think," Thomas observed, taking a sip from his own glass. "Finding out your mother had a secret friendship for 20 years would be disorienting for anyone. But she'll come around. She has Eleanor's heart." "And my stubbornness," Bill added ruefully. "God help us all." Thomas chuckled. "No wonder Olivia's so determined. Double dose of Anderson obstinacy." They drank in companionable silence for a moment, the bourbon warming Bill from the inside out. "I've been thinking about Eleanor's desk," Thomas said finally, "about the letter that's been waiting for you all these years." Bill nodded, guilt twisting in his stomach. 30 years in a box, gathering dust, while I was busy feeling sorry for myself. "Don't do that," Thomas said sharply. "Don't diminish your grief. Eleanor wouldn't want that." He softened his tone. "Grief isn't something you get over, Bill. It's something you learn to carry. And you've been carrying a double load, Eleanor and me. No wonder you needed a physical manifestation to help bear the weight." Bill considered this perspective. "You think the Mass was actually helping me, carrying part of the burden?" "In its own way, maybe," Thomas mused. "The body has wisdom the mind can't always access." Whatever the case, it preserved a piece of our shared past until you were ready to face it. He raised his glass. To Eleanor, who knew we'd find each other again someday. To Eleanor, Bill echoed, touching his glass to Thomas's. The wisest of us all. They finished their drinks in contemplative silence, each lost in memories of the remarkable woman who had connected them across decades and distance. Catherine wants to see the garden when we get back to Georgia, Thomas said eventually. Eleanor's garden, the one you wrote about in your letters to me. Bill winced. It's not much of a garden anymore. I tried to maintain it after she died, but I don't have her touch with plants. All the more reason to accept Catherine's help, Thomas replied. That woman can revive plants from the dead, I swear. Part of her physical therapy philosophy, healing through growing things. The idea of Catherine bringing Eleanor's garden back to life stirred something in Bill, a sense of continuity, of honoring his wife's memory, not through preservation of the past, but through renewal and growth. I'd like that, he said simply. Thomas nodded, satisfied. Good, because wild horses couldn't stop her once she gets an idea in her head. He glanced at his watch. It's late. Catherine will be here before noon tomorrow, and that woman expects everyone to be up and ready when she arrives. As Thomas wheeled himself toward the door, Bill was struck by how quickly their friendship had been rekindled, as if the decades of separation had been merely a pause rather than an ending. The ease between them felt both miraculous and somehow inevitable, as if they'd been moving toward this reunion their entire lives. "Tommy," he called as his friend reached the doorway. Thomas turned, eyebrows raised in question. "Thank you," Bill said inadequately, "for keeping Eleanor's letter, for waiting all these years, for everything." Thomas smiled, the expression transforming his weathered face. "That's what brothers do, Bill. And we've always been brothers, even when we didn't know where the other one was." He raised his empty glass in a final salute. "See you in the morning." After Thomas left, Bill lay back on the bed, not bothering to undress. Sleep seemed both impossible and unnecessary. His mind was too full of the day's revelations, too busy recalibrating a lifetime of assumptions. Eleanor had known Thomas was alive, had corresponded with him for 20 years, had tried in her gentle way to heal the wounds Bill refused to acknowledge. And in the end, she had left letters, breadcrumbs leading toward the reunion she believed would someday come. What else had she known? What other insights had she carried silently, respecting Bill's stubborn resistance to facing the past? The letter in the box in his closet suddenly seemed to call to him across the miles, its message urgent and long overdue. Bill resolved to read it as soon as they returned to Georgia, to finally hear Eleanor's last words to him, whatever they might reveal. As dawn lightened the sky outside his window, Bill felt a strange sense of anticipation. For the first time in decades, he was looking forward to the future, rather than dreading it or simply enduring it. Whatever came next, Catherine's arrival, the journey home, Eleanor's final letter, he would face it with open eyes and an open heart. The burden he had carried for 55 years had been set down at last. In its place was something new and tentative but growing stronger by the hour, the possibility of redemption, of connection, of peace. Not the absence of pain, but its transformation into something that could be borne with dignity and even, perhaps, with grace. Outside, birds began their morning songs, welcoming the new day with uncomplicated joy. Bill listened, really listened, to their melodies for the first time in longer than he could remember. Eleanor would have named each species from its call, a skill she'd learned from her father and had tried to teach Bill during their early morning walks. "Life goes on," she used to say when he marveled at her ability to find beauty even in difficult times. "Our job is to notice." Bill was noticing now. The bird song, the comfortable guest bed, the photograph of Thomas's extended family on the bedside table, the smell of coffee brewing in the kitchen below, the lightness in his chest where guilt and grief had resided for so long. Life, indeed, was going on, and for the first time in decades, Bill Anderson was fully present to witness it. 1 year after the surgery that changed everything, Bill Anderson stood before Eleanor's grave in the small cemetery overlooking the Georgia pines she had loved. The autumn air carried a crisp edge, rustling through leaves painted in shades of amber and crimson, Eleanor's favorite season in all its glory. "You were right, old girl," Bill said softly, placing a bouquet of late-blooming dahlias from her garden against the headstone. "You usually were." The past year had unfolded in ways Bill could never have anticipated. After that first emotional reunion in Tennessee, Thomas and his wife Catherine had become fixtures in the Anderson family's life. Monthly visits alternated between Georgia and Tennessee. Holiday celebrations expanded to include both families. The Graysons had even attended Ethan's military commission ceremony, Thomas resplendent in his Vietnam veteran's cap, pride radiating from him as he watched Bill's grandson follow in their footsteps, albeit into a different era of service. "You should see Olivia now," Bill continued his one-sided conversation with Eleanor. "Started medical school last fall. Says she's going to specialize in unusual growths and foreign body responses. Thinks what happened with me and those dog tags might help other patients someday." A gentle breeze stirred the flowers, sending petals dancing across the granite marker. Bill smiled, choosing to see it as Eleanor's response, her acknowledgement of their granddaughter's determination to transform even the most painful experiences into something healing. "Thomas and Catherine are coming for Thanksgiving again this year. Jessica's already planning the menu, fretting about having enough bedrooms with Ethan bringing his new girlfriend, too." Bill chuckled softly. "The house hasn't been this full since you were running things. I think you'd approve." The letter Eleanor had written to Thomas, entrusted to him for safekeeping until he and Bill reunited, now held a place of honor in Bill's desk, the same desk where he had found, after returning from Tennessee, the letter she had left for him. Both had been read countless times over the past year, the paper softening along well-worn creases, the words etched into Bill's heart. "My dearest Bill," Eleanor had written in her final message to him, dated just weeks before her death. "If you're reading this, it means you've finally opened the box of my papers, and I hope that means you're ready to hear what I couldn't bring myself to tell you while I lived." The letter had continued for several pages, Eleanor's handwriting growing shakier toward the end, but her thoughts remaining clear and purposeful. She had explained her discovery of Thomas's survival, her decision to contact him, her hope that someday the two men would reconnect. She wrote of her gradual understanding of Bill's trauma, insights gained through Thomas's letters about their shared experiences in Vietnam. "I came to realize," she had written, "that the wall you built around those memories wasn't just stubbornness, but self-preservation. You couldn't face what happened with Thomas because the guilt was too enormous to bear. So I became your memory keeper, holding the knowledge of his survival until you were ready to reclaim it." The letter had described her friendship with Thomas, the exchange of family photographs, the updates on children's milestones, the gradual deepening of trust between two people connected by their love for the same wounded man. "I never saw this as betrayal," Eleanor had assured him, seeming to anticipate his reaction. "Rather, it was my attempt to understand the war that came home with you, to find ways to help you heal wounds too deep for either of us to reach alone." The final paragraph had brought Bill to his knees when he first read it. "When you find Thomas, and I believe with all my heart that you will, even if I'm not there to see it, please don't waste time on regret. Neither of us were wrong in how we handled this, Bill. We were all just doing our best with the tools we had. Forgive yourself as I have always forgiven you. For the silences, for the walls, for the parts of yourself you couldn't share. I have loved you completely, even in your brokenness, perhaps especially there, your Eleanor. Now, standing before her grave with the crisp autumn air filling his lungs, Bill felt the truth of her words more deeply than ever. The past year had been one of reconciliation, not just with Thomas, but with himself. The guilt that had driven the growth on his neck had been excised along with the physical mass, allowing him to stand straighter, breathe deeper, live more fully than he had in decades. "Catherine's redesigned your rose garden," Bill told the headstone. "Says the soil pH was all wrong, whatever that means. You'd love her, Eleanor. She doesn't take nonsense from anyone, especially Thomas. Reminds me of you that way." Catherine Grayson had swept into Bill's life like a force of nature, just as Thomas had predicted. A retired physical therapist with boundless energy despite her 70 years, she had taken one look at Eleanor's neglected garden and declared it a rehabilitation project. Within months, the flower beds were blooming again, the pathways cleared, the arbors repaired and repainted. "This isn't just about plants," she'd explained to Bill as they worked side by side one spring morning. "This is about honoring Eleanor, continuing what she started instead of letting it fade away." The metaphor hadn't been lost on Bill. In tending Eleanor's garden, he was also tending her legacy, the connections she had nurtured, the healing she had tried to facilitate, the love she had planted in all their lives. "The Veterans Group is going well," he told the headstone, continuing the one-sided conversation that had become a monthly ritual. "Thomas and I are speaking at high schools now, too. Teenagers, if you can believe it. They actually listen, especially when Thomas shows them his prosthetics. Makes it real for them in a way history books can't." The Veteran Support Group had been Thomas's idea initially, a way for Bill to connect with others who understood the long shadow war could cast across a life. Bill had resisted at first, old habits of silence and stoicism difficult to break. But after the third meeting, something had shifted. Listening to other veterans, some from Vietnam, others from more recent conflicts, share stories of both trauma and resilience, had opened something in Bill, a recognition that his experience, while uniquely his own, was also part of a larger pattern of human response to inhuman situations. "Turns out talking helps," Bill admitted to Eleanor Stone. "Who'd have thought? Besides you, of course." The group now met weekly in a community center halfway between Bill's Georgia home and Thomas's Tennessee one. What had begun with 5 hesitant participants had grown to over 20 regular attendees spanning conflicts from Vietnam to Afghanistan. Bill and Thomas co-facilitated, their own story of separation and reunion serving as powerful testimony to the possibility of healing even decades after trauma. "Dr. Wilson says I'm his favorite success story," Bill continued. "Uses my case in his lectures at the medical school. Now Olivia says the students call it Anderson's phenomenon, the body preserving what the mind needs to heal." He smiled ruefully. "Pretty fancy name for an old man's neck lump." The surgical scar had faded to a thin white line, barely visible unless one knew to look for it. Bill no longer wore scarves or high-collared shirts, no longer adjusted his posture to hide what had once seemed a shameful deformity. The physical burden had been removed, and with it, gradually, the emotional weight he had carried for so many years. "Jessica says I'm like a different person," Bill told Eleanor. "She found an old video last month, Emma's 5th birthday. I'm there, but not really there, you know." Standing at the edges, watching but not participating. He paused, emotion thickening his voice. "I missed so much, Eleanor. So many years hiding behind walls I built myself." The regret was real but no longer consuming. At 79, Bill had come to accept that the past could not be rewritten, only understood and perhaps forgiven. The future, however limited by age, remained open to new possibilities. Got an email from Ethan yesterday, he continued, his tone brightening. He's being stationed in Germany next month. Thomas and I might fly over once he's settled. Do one of those river cruises you always wanted to try. Bill chuckled softly. Two old men with bad knees on a boat full of tourists. What could possibly go wrong? The idea of travel, of voluntarily leaving the safety of familiar surroundings, would have been unthinkable to the Bill of 2 years ago. But now, having crossed the more significant distance between isolation and connection, geographical journeys seemed less daunting. I might do it too, he told Eleanor Stone. Thomas is already looking up cruises, says Catherine's been after him to see Europe for 30 years. He smiled at the thought of the two couples who might have been friends in life, Eleanor and Catherine, himself and Thomas, finally united, if only in spirit and shared purpose. A shadow fell across the grave as clouds momentarily obscured the autumn sun. Bill glanced up, noting the gathering storm on the horizon. Rain was coming, as it often did this time of year. Once he would have seen it as an omen, the weather triggering memories of monsoon seasons and danger. Now it was simply rain, necessary for growth, temporary in its inconvenience. I should get going before I get soaked, Bill said, placing his hand on the cool granite one last time. Thomas and Catherine are coming for dinner. Jessica's making your pot roast recipe, though she says she can't get it quite right. As if in response, a shaft of sunlight broke through the clouds, illuminating Eleanor's name on the stone. Bill smiled, taking it as the benediction it felt like. I know, he said softly. She needs to add the red wine earlier. You told her 100 times. Walking back to his car, Bill felt the familiar mixture of melancholy and peace these cemetery visits always evoked. The grief of Eleanor's absence remained, a constant companion he had learned to live with rather than fight against. But alongside it now existed a profound gratitude for her foresight, her persistence, her refusal to allow him to remain isolated in his pain even after she could no longer reach him directly. The drive home took Bill past landmarks that had witnessed his life's major chapters. The first house he and Eleanor had owned, now painted a different color but still recognizable. The elementary school Jessica had attended, where he had reluctantly participated in father-daughter events, always keeping emotional distance. The site of his first major construction project, now a thriving community center where, ironically, the veterans group sometimes met. As he turned onto his street, Bill noticed Thomas's car already in the driveway, Catherine's distinctive gardening hat visible among Eleanor's revitalized flower beds. Jessica moved between kitchen and porch, carrying platters for what had become their traditional outdoor dinner when weather permitted. Olivia sat on the steps with her medical textbooks, looking up to wave as Bill's car approached. This tableau, family gathered, gardens tended, life continuing, struck Bill with unexpected force. This was what Eleanor had wanted for him. Not just reconciliation with Thomas, not just release from the burdens of the past, but full participation in the present, in life itself. Bill parked and made his way up the front walk, no longer bothered by the slight twinge in his back where the surgical site occasionally reminded him of its presence. Thomas looked up from where he was examining Eleanor's prized rose bushes with Catherine, his face breaking into the easy grin that 55 years of separation had somehow failed to diminish. "There he is," Thomas called. "We were about to send out a search party." "Just visiting Eleanor," Bill replied, accepting Catherine's warm hug and the glass of iced tea Jessica pressed into his hand. "Did you tell her about Ethan's deployment?" Olivia asked, closing her textbook. "And the cruise idea?" Bill nodded, settling into a porch chair that offered a view of both the garden and the gathered family. "She would have approved, I think. Especially of the part where I finally see Europe at 79. Eleanor always did believe it was never too late for new adventures," Catherine said, her Tennessee accent softened by decades of teaching physical therapy. I remember her writing that in one of her letters to Thomas. These casual references to the correspondence between his wife and his friend no longer pained Bill as they once might have. Instead, they served as welcome connections, additional threads in the tapestry of relationships that had survived separation, misunderstanding, and even death. "Speaking of adventures," Thomas said, wheeling himself closer to the porch steps, "the VA called this morning. They want us to speak at the national conference in Washington next month. Panel discussion on long-term PTSD recovery." Bill raised an eyebrow. Washington. That's a long way from our usual high school auditoriums. About time someone with actual experience had a say in how these programs are run, Thomas replied, with the gentle stubbornness that characterized him. "Too many young folks coming home with the same 1,000-yard stare we had, Bill. If our story helps even a few of them find their way back faster than we did, isn't it worth a trip to D.C.? Bill looked around at the faces watching him. Jessica's quiet hope, Olivia's analytical interest, Catherine's warm encouragement, and Thomas's unwavering belief. A year ago, even 6 months ago, he might have reflexively declined, retreating behind familiar excuses of age, discomfort, or privacy. "When do we leave?" he asked instead, his decision bringing smiles to every face. As they gathered for dinner on the porch, the conversation flowing easily between topics both profound and mundane, Bill felt the distinct sensation of worlds merging, past and present, sorrow and joy, loss and discovery. The burden he had carried for so long, both physical and emotional, had not simply vanished, but had been transformed into something else entirely. A bridge rather than a barrier, a connection rather than an isolation. Thomas raised his glass as Jessica brought out the pot roast, the aroma triggering memories of countless family dinners when Eleanor had presided over the same table. "A toast," he said, his voice carrying the weight of their shared history. "To absent friends, present joys, and the long, winding road that brings us home at last." "To Eleanor," Bill added, raising his own glass toward the garden she had loved, the home she had created, the family she had nurtured even beyond her own lifetime. "Who knew all along what we're just figuring out?" "And what's that, Grandpa?" Olivia asked, her expression suggesting she already knew the answer but wanted to hear it spoken aloud. Bill smiled, the expression coming more naturally now than it had for decades. "That the heaviest burdens are those we carry alone," he said, echoing Eleanor's words from her final letter, "but we don't have to carry them alone. Not anymore." As evening settled over the Anderson home, bringing with it the gentle rhythm of shared stories and comfortable silences, Bill felt the truth of those words settle into his bones. The mass that had grown within him, physical manifestation of trauma carried too long, had finally yielded not just its literal secrets, but the metaphorical ones as well. Some burdens, Bill had learned, transform us by their weight. Others transform us when at last we find the courage to set them down. The scar on his neck would always remain a reminder of both. But scars, as Thomas often reminded the veterans in their group, were not just markers of wounds received, but of healing achieved. Imperfect, perhaps, visible, certainly, but healing nonetheless. As night fell and lanterns illuminated the porch where this unexpected family continued their celebration of ordinary life, Bill Anderson silently thanked the doctors whose skilled hands had opened more than just a neck lump. They had opened a door to a future he had nearly refused to enter, had released him from a prison largely of his own making. "The good Lord don't give you more than you can carry," Thomas remarked as the evening wound down, repeating one of his favorite expressions. "But sometimes he overestimates." Bill laughed, the sound natural and unforced. "Or maybe," he suggested, "he sends people to help with the carrying when the load gets too heavy." Looking around at the faces illuminated by porch lights and starlight, family both biological and chosen, Bill knew with certainty that Eleanor would indeed approve. Not just of European river cruises or veterans' conferences, but of this, his hard-won emergence from the shadows of the past into the imperfect but precious present. The neck that had once borne such a visible burden now held his head high, unashamed and unbowed. The scarf that had been his constant companion lay forgotten in a drawer, and the man who had hidden behind both walked freely in a world that, while still marked by loss and pain, now contained equal measures of connection and joy. This, Bill thought as he watched Thomas regale Olivia with stories of their youth, was what healing looked like. Not the absence of scars, but the presence of life alongside them. Not forgetting, but remembering without being consumed. Not isolation, but the courage to be known, flawed and human, and still worthy of love. "You coming in, Dad?" Jessica called from the doorway as others began gathering dishes and preparing to move inside. "It's getting chilly out here." Bill looked up at his daughter, Eleanor's daughter, and saw in her face the same mixture of strength and compassion that had drawn him to her mother all those years ago. "In a minute," he replied, his voice steady. "Just want to look at the stars a bit longer." As the others moved inside, carrying with them the warm bubble of conversation and laughter, Bill remained on the porch, his gaze lifted to the vast Georgia sky. The same stars had shone over Vietnam, over Tennessee, over all the places where pieces of his story had unfolded, the same stars Eleanor had gazed upon during their years together and continued to gaze upon, perhaps, from whatever vantage point awaited beyond this life. "Thank you," he whispered to the night, to Eleanor, to whatever forces had conspired to bring him to this moment of peace, "for not giving up on me." From inside came the sound of Thomas's distinctive laugh, followed by Olivia's eager voice asking another question about their youth. Bill smiled, knowing it was time to join them, to add his own memories to the tapestry being woven inside. The man who rose from that porch chair bore little resemblance to the one who had reluctantly visited Dr. Wilson just over a year before. His shoulders, once perpetually tensed against remembered threats, now carried only the natural stoop of age. His neck, once hidden beneath layers of fabric, now bore its surgical scar as a badge of honor rather than shame. His eyes, once guarded and distant, now met the world with the hard-won wisdom of someone who had journeyed through darkness and emerged, battered but intact, into light. Bill Anderson stepped through his front door, leaving behind the burden he had carried for too long, and walked toward the voices of those who had helped him set it down at last. Have you been carrying burdens that were never yours to bear? Bill Anderson spent 55 years believing he'd failed his best friend, hiding both physical and emotional scars beneath carefully arranged scarves and silence. It took a medical crisis and his granddaughter's persistence to reveal the truth, that sometimes our deepest wounds contain unexpected healing. What burden might you be ready to set down today? The weight on Bill's back wasn't just a tumor. It was unprocessed grief, survivor's guilt, and missed connections that his body refused to let him ignore any longer. Eleanor's wisdom echoes for all of us. The heaviest burdens are those we carry alone. Yet it's never too late for second chances. At 78, Bill discovered that healing doesn't mean erasing scars, but finding the courage to show them, to reconnect, to step back into life's fullness. What relationship in your life might be waiting for renewal even after decades of silence? What grief have you carried alone that might be lighter if shared? Share your story in the comments. Your words might be the key that helps someone else unlock their own healing journey.